In the morning, my son texted me that plans had changed and I was not coming on the cruise. His wife wanted only her family on this trip. The very next day, I canceled his payments, sold his house, and left town. When they came back, the house was completely gone. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Edgar. I am 69 years old and I am still processing the betrayal my own family orchestrated against me. I stood in my bedroom folding my formal Navy suit and placing it inside my leather suitcase. I am an African-American man who spent 40 years standing on freezing concrete floors. I inhaled the metallic tang of Freon and industrial grease every single day. I built a commercial heating and refrigeration empire from a single rusted van into a tri-state operation. I handed the daily operations to an executive board 5 years ago when my beautiful wife Valerie passed away. I gave my only son Darren a sprawling house in the suburbs and a highly lucrative administrative position at my firm. I believed my grueling sacrifices had permanently secured his future. My phone vibrated heavily on the mahogany nightstand. The screen illuminated the dark room with a direct message from Darren. He wrote that plans had changed and I was not coming on the family cruise tomorrow. He stated that Abigail wanted only her parents on this trip. He promised to drop off a check for my ticket next month. I stared at the glowing text. I had paid $50,000 for this luxury family cruise package. I had booked the grand suite specifically for Darren and his white wife Abigail. I had booked a modest cabin for myself entirely to spend time with my newborn grandson. I typed a simple reply stating that I paid for the entire trip. A red warning icon appeared next to my message. Darren had completely blocked my phone number. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not yell into the empty room. Anger is a cheap emotion that burns out far too quickly. Belief requires a solid foundation of trust, and Darren had eroded that foundation years ago. I simply sat on the edge of my bed and opened my secure banking application. I navigated to the joint account I maintained strictly to assist Darren with his exorbitant suburban property taxes. The available balance displayed $0. Darren had drained $90,000 at 6 in the morning. I stared at the number, feeling a cold realization wash over me. I fought through the brutal bank discrimination of the 80s just to secure a basic business loan for my first set of industrial tools. I swallowed pride and endured systemic rejection so my son would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. I had shielded him from the harsh reality of the world, and in doing so, I had inadvertently created a parasite. I grabbed my heavy ring of car keys. I walked out of my house and placed my scarred hands on the steering wheel of my old work truck. These hands had pulled failing commercial refrigeration units out of bankruptcy. They were certainly not going to tremble over a cowardly text message from an entitled child. I started the engine and drove directly to the suburban property I had purchased for them in cash 3 years ago. I parked 2 blocks away under the dense shade of an old oak tree. I walked down the sidewalk and slipped through the wooden side gate. I used my original master key to unlock the kitchen door with absolute silence. The house was entirely quiet. Darren and Abigail were in the adjacent dining room packing their expensive designer luggage. I stood motionless in the shadow of the pantry. I could hear their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Abigail spoke with a sharp and entitled tone that scraped against my nerves. She complained that she could not believe Darren finally told me the truth. She declared that she refused to have her wealthy parents share a dinner table with a man who smelled like machine oil and cheap cologne. She stated that my calloused hands and blue-collar demeanor were completely humiliating to her social image. Darren zipped a heavy leather bag shut and told her that he had handled the situation perfectly. He assured her they would leave for Miami in 3 hours. He explained that when they returned from the cruise, they would implement the second phase of their plan. He told Abigail he had already spoken to the director of an assisted living facility. He planned to invoke a psychiatric hold on me through the state. He wanted to claim I was experiencing severe cognitive decline and could no longer care for myself. Darren said that once the doctors evaluated me, he could easily activate his emergency medical power of attorney. He laughed and said they would sell my flagship commercial warehouses, clear all of his personal debts, and never have to deal with my moral lectures again. My chest tightened until it felt like a steel band was wrapping around my ribs. My own flesh and blood planned to lock me in a clinical psychiatric facility to steal the assets I had bled for. They wanted to strip away my freedom and my dignity so they could fund a lifestyle they never earned. I did not step into the dining room to confront them. I did not demand an explanation for their monstrous cruelty. I turned around and walked out the kitchen door, stepping back into the warm afternoon air. I pulled the door shut and locked it silently. The mourning period for the son I thought I raised ended at that exact moment. He was no longer my child. He was an active threat to my survival and my legacy. I walked back to my truck and climbed inside. I pulled my phone from my pocket and navigated to my contacts. I dialed the direct number for my corporate attorney, Gavin. Gavin was a ruthless litigator who viewed sentimentality as a dangerous tactical error. He answered on the second ring. I told him to cancel all his afternoon meetings. I instructed him to prepare emergency injunction documents and pull the property records for my son's house. I informed him that Darren had initiated a hostile takeover of my life, and we were going to sever his financial existence before the sun went down. The time for fatherly patience was permanently over. The era of silent adjustment had officially begun. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the financial district, ready to dismantle the luxurious world I had blindly financed. I drove straight into the heart of the financial district and parked my work truck between a row of sleek imported sedans. I bypassed the receptionist on the 50th floor and walked directly into the corner office of my corporate litigator. Gavin did not look up from his monitors immediately. He was a man who viewed sentimentality as a dangerous tactical error. Over the past 2 decades, he had helped me carve out my territory in a commercial refrigeration industry designed to shut men like me out. He was cold, precise, and entirely devoid of empathy. I placed my banking tablet flat on his pristine glass desk. I explained the drained joint account and repeated the conversation I had just overheard in the suburban dining room. Gavin did not offer empty sympathy or feigned shock. He merely adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses and turned his attention to his dual screens. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced aggression. He bypassed standard channels and directly accessed the county property records. I needed to know the immediate extent of the damage before I could construct a proper counteroffensive. We stared at the loading screen as the secure database compiled my son's recent legal activities. The air in the room felt unusually thin. I had spent 40 years predicting mechanical failures in massive industrial units. Now I was waiting to see how deeply my own flesh and blood had compromised my life. The screen finally populated with a list of recent filings. Gavin pointed a heavy silver pen at the top line of the digital ledger. The text outlined a transaction that made the blood pound fiercely in my ears. Darren had initiated a title transfer yesterday afternoon. He had submitted a notarized document claiming I gifted the sprawling suburban house directly to Abigail's parents. The transfer was currently listed as pending. It required only a final signature from the county clerk on Monday morning to become permanent. My son was not simply trying to lock me in a psychiatric facility. He was actively giving away the property I had bought with cash to the very people who refused to share a dinner table with me. He intended to strip me of my hard-earned assets and hand them to a family that viewed my calloused hands with absolute disgust. I instructed Gavin to block the transfer immediately. I told him I held the original deed in my secure vault and the house was solely in my name. Gavin nodded and opened a secure legal portal. He drafted an emergency injunction to halt the county clerk from processing the fraudulent deed. He attached my sworn affidavit and stamped the filing with a high-priority federal flag. The swift injunction would freeze the property in its current state. Abigail's arrogant parents would not receive the deed to a house built on my sweat. I felt a brief moment of satisfaction watching the digital confirmation of the block. I thought we had contained the threat. I was entirely wrong. The stolen house was merely a surface wound. Gavin stopped typing abruptly. The color drained slightly from his face, a physical reaction I had never witnessed in our 20 years of doing business together. He clicked into a deeply buried commercial lien registry. He turned his large monitor so I could see the document clearly. It was a massive corporate promissory note. Darren had used my social security number and my company's federal tax identification to secure a high-risk commercial loan. He had borrowed $4.5 million from a predatory shadow syndicate operating under the name Ironclad Capital. Darren had poured the illicit money into his failed tech startup, a reckless venture I had explicitly warned him against funding. To secure the massive payout, he had used my flagship commercial warehouses and my entire company stock as direct collateral. He had forged my signature on every single page of the guarantee. I stared at the digital copies of my forged handwriting in stunned silence. I had spent my youth fighting through a rigged system that denied me basic banking services because of the color of my skin. I had built an immaculate credit history through decades of flawless payments and relentless grind. My son had weaponized that flawless reputation to fund his delusions of grandeur. Gavin highlighted the terms of the loan. The repayment schedule was brutal. The entire sum defaulted next Friday. Ironclad Capital was not a traditional bank that negotiated extensions or offered grace periods. They were merciless corporate scavengers. When the clock struck midnight on Friday, the syndicate would execute a hostile takeover. They would legally seize my warehouses, my equipment, and my entire business empire to cover the bad debt. Darren had handed the keys to my legacy over to a group of financial predators. The sudden clarity hit me with the force of a physical blow. The $50,000 luxury cruise was never a generous family vacation. It was a highly calculated distraction. Darren had booked the trip to keep me trapped in international waters. He wanted me completely out of the state and unreachable when the default occurred. He needed me out of the way so the shadow lenders could seize my life's work without my interference or legal resistance. By the time the ship docked back in Miami, I would return to find my company gone, my accounts drained, and my son holding a medical proxy to lock me away before I could fight back. I stood up from the leather guest chair. The initial shock evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold and operational fury. I looked Gavin directly in the eyes and issued my first command of the counterstrike. I told him to liquidate the suburban house immediately. I demanded he find a cash buyer before the end of the business day. Gavin warned me that a same-day cash transfer would force us to sell the property at a 40% loss. He cited market values and standard appraisal protocols. I cut him off sharply. I stated clearly that I was not in the real estate business today. I was in the demolition business. I did not care about the financial loss on that specific property. I cared about the complete eradication of my son's comfort and security. I ordered him to sell the property without hesitation. Gavin did not waste a single second questioning my directive. He picked up his desk phone and dialed a contact he kept precisely for situations requiring brutal, immediate financial maneuvers. He reached a commercial property developer known for acquiring premium suburban lots, leveling the existing structures, and erecting high-density, luxury apartments. The developer was hungry for land in that specific neighborhood. Gavin placed the call on speakerphone. The developer offered 60% of the current market value contingent on a same-day cash wire and immediate, uncontested possession of the property. I leaned forward and told the voice on the speaker that we had a deal. Gavin printed the transfer documents within minutes. I took the heavy brass pen from his desk and signed my name across the crisp white pages. I transferred the title of the sprawling suburban house, legally registered solely in my name, to a corporate entity I had never heard of before today. The developer wired the funds directly into my secure private trust, bypassing any account Darren even knew existed. The transaction finalized with a sharp electronic chime from Gavin's computer. The house no longer belonged to me. It certainly did not belong to my son or his arrogant wife. It belonged to a man who intended to destroy it. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and instructed Gavin to prepare the corporate termination papers for Darren. I had physical labor to oversee right now. I drove back to the suburban neighborhood and parked my truck down the street, watching the driveway from a distance. A premium black car service arrived exactly at noon. I watched Darren and Abigail load their heavy designer luggage into the trunk. Abigail wore a wide-brimmed sun hat, laughing as she slid into the leather back seat. Darren tipped the driver, his face relaxed, projecting the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had successfully orchestrated my demise. They drove away, heading toward the international airport and their $50,000 luxury cruise. I waited 10 minutes to ensure they had merged onto the highway. Then I made a single phone call to a commercial logistics crew I frequently used for heavy warehouse relocations. I instructed them to bring 2 of their largest freight trucks to the address immediately. When the heavy diesel engines rumbled into the quiet, manicured cul-de-sac, I unlocked the front door and let the crew inside. I handed the foreman a detailed, itemized list. I told him to remove every single piece of furniture, every appliance, and every fixture I had ever purchased for this house. The crew moved with industrial efficiency. They unbolted the massive stainless steel refrigerator. They carried out the imported leather sofas. They unhooked the crystal chandeliers I had paid to have installed just 2 years ago. I stood in the center of the living room, directing the flow of labor like a conductor commanding a harsh, unforgiving symphony. I watched the physical manifestations of my blind generosity disappear out the front door, leaving nothing but bare hardwood floors and the hollow echo of heavy boots. The house was rapidly becoming a vacant shell, stripped of the unearned luxury my son had taken completely for granted. 2 massive workers approached the formal dining room to dismantle the custom mahogany table. This was the exact table where Darren and Abigail had sat just hours earlier, casually plotting my commitment to a psychiatric ward over morning coffee. As the workers unscrewed the heavy iron legs and carried the polished wood out in sections, a bitter memory surfaced. I thought back to the late 1980s. I was a young, exhausted man wearing a uniform stiff with dried grease, sitting in a sterile bank office. I had saved every penny from 3 jobs to start my commercial heating and refrigeration company. The loan officer, a man with a polite smile and cold eyes, had looked at my business plan, looked at my skin color, and denied me a basic line of credit. I was redlined out of the system. I had to build my empire by working 80-hour weeks, taking the hazardous jobs no one else wanted and bleeding for every single inch of progress. I survived a financial system explicitly designed to crush me. I swore my son would never face that kind of humiliation. I paid for his private schools, his expensive tutors, and his pristine suburban life. I thought I was protecting him from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world. Watching the movers load the last of the expensive dining chairs into the freight truck, I realized my catastrophic failure. By shielding Darren from the struggle, I had denied him the opportunity to build character. I had not protected my son. I had cultivated a ruthless, entitled parasite. I had handed him the spoils of a war he never fought, and he used those spoils to fund his own vanity. The workers finished their sweep. We left Abigail's cheap decorative pillows and Darren's golf clubs scattered on the floor. Everything else was gone. The empty rooms magnified the silence. I felt no sorrow looking at the barren walls. The removal of these items was not an act of petty vengeance. It was the surgical extraction of a deep rot that had infected my family. The freight trucks secured their heavy loads and departed, leaving the cul-de-sac as quietly as they had arrived. Minutes later, a silver luxury sedan pulled into the empty driveway. The property developer stepped out, accompanied by his site manager. I walked down the front steps and handed the developer the heavy brass keys. I informed him that the property was completely vacated and ready for his immediate possession. The developer wasted no time. He signaled to a flatbed truck idling at the end of the street. The truck crawled forward, carrying a massive yellow excavator and a commercial dumpster. The demolition crew began staging their heavy equipment directly on the pristine front lawn, crushing the manicured landscaping Abigail had obsessed over. They erected temporary chain-link fencing around the perimeter of the lot, officially transforming the luxury suburban home into an active, restricted construction zone. I stepped back onto the sidewalk, ensuring I was completely clear of the new property lines. I watched the excavator's hydraulic arm extend, positioning itself to tear through the roof the moment the city noise ordinances allowed. Darren and Abigail were currently boarding their cruise ship, toasting to their brilliant deception, completely oblivious to the fact that their sanctuary was about to be reduced to splintered wood and pulverized drywall. I turned my back on the house and reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. I pulled out my mobile phone. The physical purge of my son's life was complete. Now I needed to execute the digital erasure. I unlocked my screen and prepared to sever the remaining financial arteries, keeping his lavish lifestyle afloat. The demolition of the house was only the opening strike. The true devastation required me to dismantle his access to the outside world entirely. I stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk and pulled up the master list of utility accounts on my phone. The demolition crew was staging their heavy excavators behind the temporary chain-link fence, but I needed to ensure the property was uninhabitable before the roof caved in. I dialed the municipal water authority. I provided my secure PIN and authorized an immediate permanent shutoff to the main line. The representative asked if I wanted to schedule a final meter reading. I told her to send a technician within the hour to physically cap the valve. Next, I contacted the regional power grid. I had paid the inflated electric bills for this massive house since the day I handed Darren the keys. I instructed the operator to sever the connection and remove the physical meter from the side of the building. Finally, I called the premium fiber optic internet provider. Abigail relied on that high-speed connection to broadcast her fabricated lifestyle to her social circle. I terminated the contract and authorized the penalty fee for an immediate service blackout. The house was now a dark, dry, and disconnected shell. I refused to subsidize another drop of water or watt of electricity for 2 people who viewed my existence as a disposable commodity. The physical purge of their sanctuary was complete, but the digital eradication of their comfort had just begun. I navigated to the commercial fleet management portal on my device. For the past 4 years, my company had absorbed the monthly lease payments on a top-tier European luxury SUV. I authorized the vehicle under the assumption Darren needed reliable transportation to meet with our commercial HVAC clients. Instead, he handed the keys directly to Abigail so she could parade around her upscale yoga studios and country club luncheons. I dialed the direct line to the regional dealership director. I informed him the corporate lease on the vehicle was officially terminated due to gross unauthorized use. The director attempted to explain the standard 30-day return policy and the logistical requirements of a corporate surrender. I cut his corporate script short. I told him the vehicle was currently abandoned in the long-term parking garage at the international airport. I provided the exact GPS coordinates, the license plate number, and the specific deck level where Abigail always insisted on parking to avoid door dings. I authorized the dealership to use their emergency repossession protocols. The director recognized the severity of my tone and immediately dispatched a heavy-duty tow truck to retrieve the asset. He assured me the vehicle would be secured in their holding lot before the end of the afternoon. Abigail cherished that car as a symbol of her elevated status. She treated it as proof she had married into unlimited wealth. The dealership would soon impound that symbol, stripping away the shiny metallic armor she used to look down on the man who actually paid the monthly premium. I hung up the phone, feeling the sharp satisfaction of reclaiming the fruits of my own labor. The final pillar of Darren's false reality was his unlimited access to my corporate capital. I opened the encrypted banking portal that managed the finances for my entire tri-state operation. Darren carried 2 platinum credit cards tied directly to the executive expense account. He used them freely under the guise of entertaining potential vendors and securing commercial contracts. I now knew those funds financed his private club memberships, his high-end dinners with Abigail's arrogant parents, and his catastrophic technology startup losses. I bypassed the automated customer service system and called the senior corporate account manager directly. I had done business with this banker for over 15 years. I informed him that a massive internal breach had occurred within my organization. I instructed him to instantly flag the 2 platinum cards assigned to my son for severe corporate fraud. The manager asked if I wanted to simply lower the spending limits or place a temporary hold while we conducted an internal audit. I told him to execute a hard, permanent freeze. I explicitly ordered him to decline every single transaction attempted on those cards, regardless of the vendor or the amount. I then contacted the 3 major credit bureaus. I placed a maximum security lock on my personal and corporate identity profiles, ensuring Darren could not open a single new line of credit or attempt another fraudulent loan to cover his tracks. The financial net tightened with lethal precision. My son had built his entire adult identity on the foundation of my checking accounts. Without my money flowing through his wallet, he possessed absolutely nothing of his own. The vast reservoir of capital he believed he controlled was officially drained. The banker confirmed the cards were locked and flagged in the global network. Every register terminal and digital payment system in the world would now reject Darren's name. He was financially neutralized. I stood on the pavement and took a slow, deep breath. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of subsidizing their toxic entitlement lifted from my shoulders. The bleeding had finally stopped. Hundreds of miles away, the massive luxury cruise ship sounded its heavy departure horn across the sunlit Miami harbor. I could easily envision Darren and Abigail standing on the teak deck of their grand suite. I pictured Abigail holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne, adjusting her designer sunglasses and breathing a sigh of immense relief. I knew they were clinking their glasses together, celebrating what they believed was a flawless victory. They were toasting to the brilliant deception that kept the burdensome blue-collar father completely out of their elite social circle. They were sailing into international waters, firmly convinced that they had successfully orchestrated my institutionalization and secured their permanent financial independence. They were completely unaware that the suburban fortress they left behind was currently a gutted shell waiting for the wrecking ball. They had no idea their luxury vehicle was strapped to the back of a flatbed tow truck, heading to a secure impound lot. They did not know their platinum credit cards were currently functioning as useless pieces of plastic. Their entire existence had been systematically erased in a matter of hours. I looked at the dark screen of my phone and slid it into the heavy canvas pocket of my work jacket. I turned my back on the empty, doomed property and walked toward my rusted truck. The domestic purge was complete, but the true threat still loomed over my legacy. My son's deceit had placed my entire commercial refrigeration empire in the crosshairs of a ruthless syndicate. I climbed into the cab and turned the ignition. I had to face ironclad capital. I slammed the gear shift into drive and pulled away from the curb. The shadow lenders were expecting a helpless victim to default on a forged multi-million-dollar loan next Friday. They were about to meet a man who had spent 4 decades crushing obstacles into dust. I drove toward the financial district, ready to buy the noose my son had tied. I drove my rusted truck into the polished underground parking garage of an unmarked high-rise in the financial district. Ironclad Capital did not advertise their presence. They operated in the shadows, preying on desperate businessmen and bleeding them dry through extortionate commercial loans. I took the freight elevator to the 42nd floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of dark marble and tinted glass designed to make borrowers feel utterly insignificant. The security guard, a massive man in a tailored suit, stepped forward and asked for my appointment. I did not stop walking. I told him my name and kept moving straight toward the heavy frosted double doors at the end of the hall. He reached for my shoulder, but my corporate attorney Gavin stepped directly into his path, flashing a heavy federal injunction binder like a shield. I pushed open the heavy glass doors without knocking. The managing director sat behind a sprawling desk, examining a digital ledger. He looked up, his face hardening into a professional scowl at the uninvited intrusion. I walked up to the edge of his desk and planted my calloused hands on the polished wood. I introduced myself clearly and evenly. I informed him that my son had forged my signature on their loan documents and that they had advanced $4.5 million on entirely fraudulent collateral. The director steepled his fingers, completely unfazed, and stated that they held legally binding contracts and would take my company on Friday. I did not raise my voice or react to his hollow threat. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick, certified forensic audit. Gavin had drafted and sealed it just an hour prior, utilizing the best handwriting analysts in the state. I threw the heavy document onto the center of the director's desk. The sharp thud echoed in the silent office. I told him he was holding a fabricated document that would not survive 5 minutes in a federal courtroom. I leaned closer, letting the sheer weight of my 40 years in business press down on him. I explained that if he attempted to seize a single warehouse or touch a single piece of my commercial refrigeration equipment, my legal team would bury his syndicate in federal litigation. We would subpoena every email, every internal memo, and every wire transfer his firm had executed over the past decade. I promised him that we would expose their failure to perform basic due diligence to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The director's confident posture cracked. He reached out and opened the audit. He quickly reviewed the irrefutable evidence of the forged signatures and the fake notary stamps Darren had used. He realized his firm had made a catastrophic amateur error by trusting my son's arrogant designer suit facade instead of verifying the core assets. The blood drained from his face as he calculated the sheer scale of the legal nightmare staring him down. A $4.5 million mistake meant his own board of directors would likely strip him of his position, freeze his accounts, and let him take the fall for the federal fraud. He looked up from the pages, the aggressive veneer completely gone. The reality of the situation had settled into his bones. He was holding a worthless piece of paper, and I was holding the match to burn his entire operation to the ground. The managing director swallowed hard, closing the forensic binder. He sat back in his chair, the leather squeaking in the tense quiet. He asked what my proposal was, his voice losing its corporate edge and slipping into raw self-preservation. I told him I did not come to negotiate an extension or beg for mercy. I offered him a brutal, immediate solution to his catastrophic error. I stated that I would pay the entire $4.5 million principal today in cash to clear the debt from his books entirely. He blinked, clearly shocked that a man standing in a grease-stained jacket possessed that level of liquid capital. I continued before he could speak. I told him this payout came with an absolute non-negotiable condition. In exchange for the wire transfer, Ironclad Capital would legally assign the entire debt and all its associated penalties directly to me. I demanded the total transfer of the promissory note. I would become Darren's sole unforgiving creditor. He would owe the money, the interest, and the fraudulent consequences directly to the father he had betrayed. The director hesitated. He weighed the impending legal nightmare and the destruction of his career against an immediate clean infusion of liquid cash that would completely erase his mistake. It was the easiest business decision he would ever make in his life. He picked up his phone and summoned his chief legal counsel into the room. He instructed his team to draft the assignment papers immediately. I stood perfectly still, watching the rapid flurry of activity. Gavin scrutinized every single clause of the transfer agreement, ensuring Ironclad Capital relinquished all rights to my company and firmly placed the noose of Darren's debt securely into my hands. I was buying my son's financial ruin piece by piece, ensuring that when the hammer finally fell, it would be my hand holding the handle. The legal team printed the final documents, binding them in a stark black folder. The director pushed the papers across the desk. He did not look me in the eye as he handed over the instrument of my son's destruction. I took the heavy brass pen from Gavin and signed my name with deliberate, forceful strokes. I authorized the wire transfer from my private trust, a heavily guarded account I had spent decades building through grueling labor and relentless saving. Within 10 minutes, the transaction cleared the federal banking system. The director received the digital confirmation on his monitor. He exhaled a long, shaky breath and handed me the original forged loan documents. I folded them and placed them in the inner pocket of my jacket. I walked out of the syndicate's headquarters holding the absolute control of my son's future. I drove back to my office, placing the documents in my secure vault. I had successfully insulated my commercial empire from the predatory strike and purchased the ultimate leverage. I spent the next 10 days working on my refrigeration units, breathing in the familiar scent of copper and industrial solvent, waiting with the terrifying patience of a man who has nothing left to lose. Hundreds of miles away, the massive luxury cruise ship finally blew its heavy departure horn and docked back in the sunlit Miami harbor. Darren and Abigail walked down the gangway, their skin tanned, their expressions relaxed, totally unaware of the devastation waiting for them. They were returning to a life that had been surgically dismantled. They stepped onto the pavement, completely confident in their impending wealth, walking directly into the trap I had spent the last 10 days building around them. The vacation was over. The brutal adjustment was about to begin. They gathered their heavy designer luggage, laughing as they moved through the customs terminal. They expected to return to their sprawling suburban sanctuary, lock me in a psychiatric facility, and assume total control of my legacy. Instead, they were walking into an absolute void. I sat at my desk looking at the clock, counting down the minutes until their artificial world violently collapsed. Gavin had dispatched a private investigator to the airport to document the exact moment my son's illusion of control shattered. I sat behind my heavy mahogany desk at the corporate office, receiving real-time text updates as their artificial reality collapsed. Darren and Abigail disembarked the luxury cruise ship, sporting deep tans and arrogant smiles. They dragged their heavy designer luggage through the bustling terminal and walked out into the sweltering, suffocating heat of the long-term parking garage. They arrived at the exact concrete space where they had parked the corporate luxury SUV. It was completely empty. My investigator noted that Darren clicked his electronic key fob, frantically scanning the dark garage, instantly assuming the vehicle had been targeted by local car thieves. He pulled out his phone to contact his premium insurance provider, only to discover a completely dead screen. His cellular service had been permanently terminated by my direct order. Abigail rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by the unexpected inconvenience. She marched over to the premium black car service desk and confidently handed the attendant her platinum credit card. The machine beeped a sharp, undeniable rejection. She offered a second card. The system declined it again. A third card yielded the same humiliating result. The attendant politely but firmly asked them to step aside so paying customers could process their rides. Stripped of their digital wealth and stranded without any means of communication, they were forced to drag their heavy rolling bags across the blistering asphalt to a crowded municipal bus stop. The grueling 40-minute ride back to their suburban sanctuary was their first genuine taste of the blue-collar reality they so deeply despised. They sat in stiff silence, surrounded by the exact working-class citizens Abigail explicitly refused to share a dinner table with. The financial quarantine had effectively trapped them. The public bus dropped them at the outer edge of their pristine gated subdivision. They were forced to haul their cumbersome luggage by foot down a mile of immaculate sun-baked sidewalks. Abigail's expensive heels blistered her feet, slowing their pace to a miserable crawl. Darren seethed with visible anger, loudly promising to sue the auto dealership and fire his corporate banking managers the very moment he reached his home office. They turned the final corner onto their quiet cul-de-sac, fully expecting to find the cool, air-conditioned refuge of their sprawling suburban fortress. Instead, they were greeted by a thick, choking cloud of pulverized drywall and the deafening roar of heavy diesel machinery. A towering chain-link fence surrounded the entire perimeter of the property lot. The roof of the house was entirely gone, exposing the skeletal wooden rafters to the harsh afternoon sun. A massive yellow excavator was parked squarely in the center of the crushed front lawn. Its hydraulic steel claw was currently tearing directly through the walls of the grand formal dining room. the exact room where they had casually plotted my commitment to a psychiatric ward just 10 days earlier. Dust billowed high into the sky as the custom bay windows shattered into thousands of jagged fragments. Darren dropped his leather suitcase onto the pavement, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The pristine reality he believed he commanded had literally been reduced to splintered timber and rubble right before his eyes. Abigail stood frozen on the concrete, her hands covering her mouth in horror as the excavator's heavy metal tracks ground relentlessly over the remnants of her imported Italian tile entryway. The sanctuary they had planned to steal from me had been systematically and legally erased. The sheer shock instantly mutated into a blind, hysterical panic. Darren completely ignored the heavy warning signs bolted to the chain-link fence. He sprinted through a gap in the barricade, dodging chunks of falling debris and screaming at the top of his lungs over the engine noise. He charged across the ruined landscaping directly toward the construction foreman, who was standing near a portable generator in a neon safety vest. Darren grabbed the heavy-set man by the shoulder, spinning him around and demanding that he immediately shut down the heavy machinery. Darren screamed that he was the legal owner of the property and threatened to have every single worker on the site arrested for criminal trespassing and malicious destruction of property. The foreman did not flinch. He shoved Darren backward with enough raw force to send my son stumbling into the dry dirt. Two large demolition workers holding heavy steel crowbars stepped forward immediately, forming a protective wall around their supervisor. The foreman calmly reached into his vest pocket and produced a laminated county-certified building permit. He shoved the legal document directly into Darren's face. He informed my son that his commercial development firm had purchased the lot for cash 10 days ago. He stated clearly that they were legally clearing the land to lay the foundation for a high-density townhouse complex. The foreman pointed a thick finger at the street and warned Darren that if he did not step off the active construction site within 10 seconds, he would personally have him arrested for trespassing and physical assault. Abigail stood hyperventilating on the sidewalk. She frantically tapped her useless phone screen, screaming that her wealthy parents were scheduled to arrive for dinner in exactly 2 hours. She shrieked at the workers, begging to know where their house had gone. The demolition crew ignored her cries. The excavator roared again, bringing down the master bedroom walls in a deafening crash. Darren realized the foreman was not intimidated by his tailored suit or his empty threats. The law was entirely on the developer's side. Defeated, publicly humiliated, and covered in a fine layer of white plaster dust, Darren retreated to the safety of the public sidewalk. He stood next to his weeping wife, his chest heaving with unadulterated panic. They were entirely stranded. Neither of their phones could connect to a cellular network. Their platinum credit cards were functioning as useless pieces of plastic. Their luxury vehicle was sitting securely in a dealership impound lot. Their home was currently being scooped into a commercial dumpster by a mechanical claw. A local teenager walking a golden retriever paused on the sidewalk, staring openly at the chaotic scene unfolding before him. Darren lunged forward, practically tackling the young man to beg for the immediate use of his smartphone. The teenager handed it over, cautiously stepping back from the crazed man in the ruined suit. Darren possessed no access to his digital contact list, but my personal cell phone number was the one sequence of digits he had memorized since childhood. He dialed the number with shaking, frantic fingers. I was sitting comfortably in the leather chair of my corporate office, reviewing the finalized debt transfer documents I had secured from Ironclad Capital. My phone rang on the desk. I recognized the local area code of the incoming call. I answered on the first ring, letting the heavy silence hang in the air. Darren's voice erupted through the speaker, cracking with sheer, unrestrained hysteria. He screamed that someone had stolen the house right out from under them. He shrieked that the cars were missing, the banking cards were dead, and that I needed to call the corporate accountants immediately to fix the catastrophic error. I did not raise my voice. I listened to the satisfying sound of the excavator grinding timber into dust in the background of his call. The perfect trap had finally snapped shut. I took a slow breath, fully prepared to execute the sidewalk checkmate. I sat in the heavy leather chair of my corporate office, the phone pressed to my ear. I listened to my son hyperventilate on the public sidewalk. He shrieked that criminals had stolen his property. He demanded that I contact my banking managers and fix the massive error immediately. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, flat precision of a man reading a shipping manifest. I informed Darren that no one had stolen the house. I told him that I had sold the property for cash 10 days ago. I explained that I personally terminated the lease on his luxury vehicle and instructed my accountants to permanently close the joint checking accounts. The frantic screaming on the other end of the line ceased, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Darren finally stammered that I had no legal right to sell the house. He claimed it was his primary residence. I reminded him that the deed was registered exclusively in the name of my corporate trust. Darren's shock rapidly morphed into a blind, desperate rage. He screamed that I was a senile old fool. He threatened to activate his medical power of attorney. He swore he would drag me into a courtroom, declare me legally incompetent, and seize control of my entire commercial refrigeration empire by force. I let him finish his pathetic tirade. I told him his power of attorney was a forged, worthless piece of paper. I advised him to look at the street. A sleek black town car pulled silently up to the curb, stopping just inches from where Darren and Abigail stood, covered in plaster dust. The tinted rear window lowered. My corporate litigator Gavin stepped out onto the blistering pavement. Gavin did not wear a sympathetic expression. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a thick black leather folder. He approached my son with the clinical detachment of an executioner. Darren lowered the borrowed cell phone, staring at the attorney in utter confusion. He recognized Gavin from my corporate holiday parties, but he had never faced the man in a hostile legal confrontation. Gavin did not offer a handshake. He unclasped the leather folder and withdrew a stack of formal legal documents. He handed Darren a certified corporate termination letter effective immediately severing his employment and permanently revoking his executive health insurance. Next, he handed him a finalized eviction notice, proving the suburban property had been legally liquidated and transferred to a commercial developer. Darren's hand shook as he took the heavy paperwork. He attempted to argue, shouting that he was an executive vice president and could not be fired on a public sidewalk. Gavin completely ignored the pathetic outburst. He reached back into the folder and produced the certified forensic audit. He shoved the high-resolution photographs of Darren's forged signatures directly into my son's chest. The color completely vanished from Darren's face. The arrogant facade collapsed the moment his eyes registered the irrefutable proof of his criminal actions. The documents meticulously detailed the fake notary stamps and the fraudulent corporate seals he had used to secure the massive loan. He was entirely exposed, standing on the street with absolutely nowhere to hide. Darren stared at the forensic audit, his breath hitching in his chest. He tried to rally his remaining arrogance. He sneered at Gavin, loudly declaring that the forgery did not matter. He claimed he owed the $4.5 million to Ironclad Capital, not to his father. He boasted that the Shadow Syndicate would seize my commercial warehouses by Friday, rendering my termination letters completely meaningless. Gavin allowed a cold, sharp smile to form on his face. He pulled the final document from the heavy folder. It was the official reassignment of debt. Gavin held the paper up so Darren could read the crisp legal text in the afternoon sun. He informed my son that I had personally visited the managing director of Ironclad Capital 10 days ago. He explained that I had paid the entire multi-million-dollar principal in cash to clear the syndicate's books. Gavin stated with absolute precision that Ironclad Capital had legally assigned the entire debt, along with all associated fraud penalties, directly to me. I was no longer just his father. I was his sole, unforgiving creditor. Darren's knees visibly buckled. The realization of his catastrophic miscalculation crushed the remaining air out of his lungs. He had tried to outsmart a man who had survived the most brutal corporate environments in the country. Gavin did not give him a single moment to recover. He delivered the final, devastating ultimatum. He informed Darren that the massive commercial loan had officially defaulted at midnight. He stated that Darren had exactly 48 hours to repay the $4.5 million in full. If the funds were not wired into my corporate trust by the strict deadline, Gavin would personally hand the entire forensic forgery dossier over to the district attorney. Darren was facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate wire fraud and identity theft. He was trapped in a financial vice with absolutely no escape route, cornered by his own relentless greed. Abigail stepped forward, snatching the thick stack of legal documents right out of her husband's trembling hands. She rapidly scanned the termination letter, the eviction notice, and the massive federal fraud evidence. Her eyes widened in sheer horror as she processed the exact figures of the $4.5 million debt. She looked at Darren with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The lavish illusion he had carefully constructed around her was entirely shattered. She realized in an instant that she had not married the wealthy heir to a commercial refrigeration empire. She had married a destitute, bankrupt criminal standing on the precipice of a lengthy federal prison sentence. She screamed at him, her voice shrill and accusatory. She demanded to know how he could lie to her about owning the company and possessing unlimited capital. Darren reached out begging her to calm down, promising he could fix the catastrophic situation if she just called her wealthy parents for a bridge loan. Abigail aggressively slapped his hand away. She possessed zero loyalty to a man stripped of his financial utility. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a hidden wad of emergency cash. She stepped into the street and frantically hailed a passing taxi. The yellow cab pulled over. She threw her heavy luggage into the trunk, climbed into the back seat, and slammed the door shut without offering a single word of farewell. The taxi sped away, leaving Darren entirely abandoned on the dusty curb next to a chain-link fence. He was totally isolated, facing a multi-million-dollar debt and a rapidly ticking 48-hour countdown to federal incarceration. He had to find shelter and a wealthy ally immediately to survive the fallout. Darren stood entirely alone on the dusty sidewalk covered in the white plaster dust of his ruined living room. His wife had abandoned him and his father had legally crushed his entire existence. He stared at the taillights of Abigail's taxi disappearing down the suburban street until they vanished completely. He had no functioning credit cards and no cellular service to call for a ride. He picked up his heavy leather suitcase with trembling hands. The closest place he could seek refuge was the elite Oak Ridge Country Club located exactly 3 miles away. Darren had spent the last 4 years cultivating a network of affluent investors and high society heirs at that exact club. He firmly believed these men were his loyal brothers. He was confident that if he could just reach the clubhouse and explain his temporary liquidity issue, one of his wealthy golfing partners would gladly float him a bridge loan to secure a defense attorney. He began the grueling walk under the blistering afternoon sun. His custom-tailored Italian leather shoes were designed for padded office carpets, not miles of unforgiving concrete. Within the first mile, painful blisters formed on his heels. His designer silk shirt became drenched in sour sweat. He dragged his luggage along the shoulder of the busy highway, watching ordinary working people drive past him in older cars. He was experiencing the exact blue-collar struggle he had mocked his entire life. The sheer physical exhaustion began to break his arrogant spirit before he even reached the gates. It took Darren nearly 2 hours to reach the towering wrought-iron gates of the country club. He limped up the long, manicured driveway, his suit stained with sweat and demolition dust. He left his heavy suitcase hidden behind a row of manicured hedges near the entrance so he could maintain a shred of his usual dignity. He pushed open the heavy glass doors of the grand lobby, desperately expecting the cool rush of air conditioning and a warm greeting from the staff. Instead, the general manager immediately stepped out from behind the mahogany concierge desk and blocked his path. The manager was a man who catered exclusively to extreme wealth, and he possessed a flawless radar for financial ruin. He did not offer a polite smile or a welcoming handshake. He spoke in a loud, carrying voice that completely shattered the quiet elegance of the lobby. He informed Darren that he was no longer permitted to step foot on the premises. Darren tried to push past him, aggressively claiming he was a premium founding member of the club with full access privileges. The manager crossed his arms and loudly corrected him. He stated that Darren's premium membership was entirely funded by a corporate account belonging to my commercial refrigeration company. The manager explained that my accounting department had officially revoked the corporate backing early this morning. He then delivered the final crushing blow. He announced to the entire lobby that the automatic draft for Darren's monthly club dues had bounced due to insufficient funds. The phrase echoed off the marble walls. In the world of high society, a bounced payment is an unforgivable social crime. Darren turned pale as several passing club members stopped to stare at his disheveled appearance. Darren desperately looked past the manager and peered directly into the lavish main dining room. He spotted a table of 3 men he considered his closest confidants. These were the exact men he bought expensive scotch for, using my corporate credit cards. They were the men who had promised to fund his failed technology startup and constantly praised his business acumen. Darren waved his arms frantically and called out their names, begging them to come out to the lobby and vouch for him. The men at the table looked up from their plates of expensive seafood. They saw Darren covered in sweat and dirt, being aggressively blocked by the club manager. They did not stand up to defend their supposed brother. They did not walk over to offer financial assistance or even a basic ride home. They simply averted their eyes, picked up their crystal glasses, and continued their private conversation as if he did not exist. The brutal reality of transactional friendship slammed into Darren with devastating force. These men never cared about his intellect or his personality. They only cared about the unlimited capital they believed he controlled. Now that the money was completely gone, his social value was instantly reduced to zero. He was a walking liability to their own reputations. The manager snapped his fingers and summoned 2 large security guards from the front entrance. He ordered them to remove the trespasser from the building immediately. The guards grabbed Darren by the arms, dragging him backward through the heavy glass doors. He thrashed and screamed empty threats about suing the establishment, but he had absolutely no leverage left. The guards shoved him down the front steps and warned him that if he returned, they would call the county sheriff for criminal trespassing. Darren stumbled back to the hedges to retrieve his suitcase. He sat on the hot curb, rubbing his bleeding feet. The illusion of his elite social status had been violently stripped away in a matter of minutes. He opened his wallet and counted the few crumpled bills he had hidden inside. He had exactly $40 in physical cash. It was barely enough to survive a single night. He limped another half-mile down the highway until he found a dilapidated neon-lit motel that accepted cash without requiring a valid credit card on file. He rented a filthy room with peeling wallpaper and a broken air conditioner. He lay on the stained mattress, staring at the water-damaged ceiling as the gravity of his situation crushed his chest. The 48-hour deadline to repay my $4.5 million loan was rapidly ticking away. If he did not find a miraculous source of capital, he would be wearing a federal prison jumpsuit by the end of the week. While Darren suffered in complete isolation, his wife was already putting a new offensive strategy into motion. Abigail had directed her taxi straight to the opulent estate of her wealthy parents. She ran crying into the arms of her arrogant father, a man named Mitchell. Mitchell was a ruthless venture capitalist who viewed my blue-collar background with deep, unfiltered contempt. Abigail fed him a hysterical, twisted narrative to cover her own complicity. She claimed I had lost my mind, aggressively destroyed their home, and left her destitute on the street. Mitchell immediately gathered his legal team enraged that a working-class mechanic had dared to humiliate his daughter. He prepared to launch a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit against my corporate empire. I was sitting behind the heavy mahogany desk in my corporate office, reviewing the final liquidation documents when the glass doors of my executive suite swung open violently. Mitchell walked in without bothering to knock or announce his arrival. He is Abigail's father. He is a ruthless venture capitalist who built his wealth on aggressive acquisitions and generational privilege. He wore a pristine silver suit and a look of absolute disgust. He had always viewed my blue-collar background with deep and unfiltered contempt. He treated me like a hired laborer who had somehow stumbled into the boardroom by pure accident, completely ignoring the 40 years of brutal and back-breaking labor it took to build my commercial heating and refrigeration empire from the ground up. I watched him storm in and realized that arrogance is a generational disease. He had raised Abigail to believe she was untouchable, and now he was here to enforce that delusion. He slammed his expensive Italian leather briefcase onto my desk. He did not say hello. He immediately began shouting about the fragile condition of his daughter. He claimed Abigail arrived at his estate in hysterics. He said she was deeply traumatized by my aggressive destruction of her suburban home. Mitchell threatened to launch a massive and public lawsuit against my commercial business. He demanded immediate financial compensation for the severe emotional distress and public humiliation I had allegedly inflicted upon his family. He boasted that his elite legal team would freeze my operations and drag my name through the mud until I handed over half of my company to repair the damage. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice or call for my security guards to escort him out. I let him yell until his face turned a furious shade of red. I waited for his arrogant momentum to completely run out before I made my move. When Mitchell finally stopped shouting to catch his breath, the room fell entirely silent. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila folder. I placed it squarely in the center of the glass surface. I told Mitchell that before he unleashed his army of corporate lawyers to dismantle my life, he needed to carefully review his own financial history. I told him that people who live in glass houses should not throw stones, especially when those glass houses were built on stolen ground. I opened the folder. Inside was a meticulously documented ledger that Gavin and my forensic accountants had compiled during our intense investigation into Darren's catastrophic commercial debt. I slid a stack of highlighted bank statements toward Mitchell. I explained that I had been reviewing the external consulting fees his venture capital firm had been receiving over the past 4 years. Mitchell had always claimed these monthly payments were legitimate retainers for advising my son on market expansion and corporate strategy. I pointed to the origin routing numbers on the printed transfers. I revealed the brutal truth. Those consulting fees were never authorized by my executive board. They were actually embezzled corporate funds. Darren had been systematically skimming money from my commercial accounts, forging expense reports, and funneling the cash directly into Mitchell's firm to buy his father-in-law's approval. Mitchell had gladly accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen money. He turned a blind eye to the source because it funded his lavish lifestyle and fed his immense ego. The color completely drained from his face as he stared at the crisp and undeniable proof of his complicity. He realized instantly that his daughter's luxury life was built on money stolen directly from the man he was currently trying to intimidate. Mitchell tried to step back from the desk. His arrogant posture crumbled under the sheer weight of the evidence. He stammered that he had absolutely no idea the funds were misappropriated. He claimed he thought Darren was independently wealthy and fully authorized to distribute the capital. I told him ignorance was not a valid legal defense for accepting stolen corporate assets. I leaned forward and rested my scarred hands on the glass. I presented him with a very simple and non-negotiable choice. I told Mitchell he could take his briefcase, walk out of my building, and permanently drop every single threat of litigation against me. He would instruct his daughter to handle her own ruined marriage without a single dime of my money. If he agreed to those exact terms, the manila folder would remain locked securely in my vault. However, if he decided to file a single motion in civil court, I would immediately submit the entire forensic ledger to the Internal Revenue Service. I promised him I would personally hand the evidence to federal investigators and offer my full cooperation to ensure he faced maximum penalties. I would highlight his firm for aggressive money laundering and severe tax evasion. I painted a very clear picture of federal agents raiding his pristine estate, freezing his venture capital accounts, and dismantling his flawless social reputation piece by piece. I asked him if defending his entitled daughter was worth spending the final years of his life in a federal penitentiary. Mitchell looked down at the highlighted bank statements. He was a man who calculated financial risk for a living, and right now the math was screaming at him to surrender. He knew he was holding a losing hand. The immense leverage he thought he possessed had instantly vaporized. He was completely cornered by his own unchecked greed. Mitchell did not attempt to argue or salvage his wounded pride. He closed his briefcase with shaking hands. He turned around and walked out of my office without uttering another word. He left the threat of his multi-million-dollar lawsuit dead on the floor. He rushed back to his grand estate and immediately informed Abigail that she was entirely on her own. He refused to risk his own empire to fight a battle he knew he could not win, proving that his loyalty only extended as far as his bank account. He told her she would receive no legal funding and no financial support to combat my actions. Abigail was left completely isolated. Her husband was a bankrupt criminal hiding in a cheap motel, and her powerful father had abandoned her crusade simply to save his own skin. Stripped of all her financial armor and elite backing, Abigail realized she only possessed one remaining piece of leverage against me. She had watched her carefully constructed reality burn to the ground, and she knew she could not fight me in a boardroom. She had to use the only thing I truly cared about. Later that evening, my private cell phone rang. It was Abigail. Her voice was no longer filled with arrogant entitlement. It was cold, sharp, and desperate. She informed me that she had packed a bag and taken my newborn grandson to an undisclosed location. She stated clearly that if I did not immediately agree to her new financial terms and fund her lifestyle, I would never see my grandchild again. She was attempting to hold my legacy hostage. The financial war was over, but the most vicious and personal battle was just beginning. My private cell phone vibrated on the heavy mahogany desk shortly after Mitchell fled my office. The caller identification displayed Abigail's number. I answered the call and placed the device on speakerphone to record the audio directly into my corporate security server. Abigail did not begin the conversation with a polite greeting. Her voice was entirely devoid of her usual country club arrogance. It was cold, sharp, and laced with absolute desperation. She informed me that she had packed a bag and taken my newborn grandson to an undisclosed location. She stated clearly that if I did not immediately agree to her new financial terms, I would never see my grandchild again. She demanded a direct deposit of $15,000 on the first of every month into her personal checking account. She explicitly stated this money was required to maintain the standard of living she deserved. She treated my flesh and blood like a disposable pawn in a hostile business negotiation. She attempted to hold my family legacy hostage because her wealthy father had abandoned her, and her husband was a bankrupt criminal. I did not raise my voice or react to her pathetic extortion attempt. I let her lay out her entire list of demands. I allowed her to articulate exactly how much money she wanted in exchange for access to my grandson. I remained completely silent until she finished speaking. I ended the call without offering a single word of confirmation or denial. Her silent panic was the only response I needed. I refused to negotiate with an extortionist. I immediately called Gavin back into my executive suite. I handed him the digital audio recording of Abigail's ransom demand. I instructed my attorney to launch a devastating legal strike against her. Gavin smiled a predatory smile. He immediately drafted an aggressive petition for grandparents' rights in the county family court. We did not merely request standard visitation. We structured the petition to entirely neutralize Abigail's leverage. Gavin utilized the audio recording to prove she was actively using the child for financial extortion. We attached the forensic financial documents detailing her absolute lack of personal income. We highlighted the fact that her husband was currently under federal investigation for a multi-million-dollar commercial fraud. We even included the sealed ledger implicating her father in severe money laundering, effectively proving that she had no safe harbor and no legitimate means to support the child. We painted a meticulously documented picture of a desperate, unfunded woman attempting to ransom an infant. Gavin filed the motion with an emergency request for a hearing. He dispatched a courier to serve the papers to her parents' estate within the hour. Abigail thought she held the ultimate trump card. She did not realize she had just handed my legal team the exact ammunition required to strip away her parental autonomy. I had spent decades securing commercial refrigeration contracts against ruthless competitors who tried to squeeze me out of the market. I knew exactly how to dismantle a hostile negotiator. You never meet their demands. You simply destroy their entire foundation and remove their ability to demand anything at all. The family court judge would look at her blatant extortion attempt with absolute disgust. She was fighting a war she was severely unequipped to handle. While Gavin finalized the aggressive family court filings, I contacted my primary wealth management firm to secure my grandson's future. I refused to let my family legacy be squandered by a woman who viewed my blue-collar background with profound contempt. I established an ironclad blind trust entirely dedicated to the child. I seeded the account with a substantial initial deposit, but I attached brutal, unbreakable stipulations to the capital. The trust was managed exclusively by a fiercely independent fiduciary who reported only to my legal team. The money could never be withdrawn as liquid cash. The funds were strictly designated to pay for premium healthcare, private education, and essential developmental needs. Furthermore, the financial distributions would be paid directly to the service providers. The private academy would receive a corporate check. The pediatric specialists would receive a direct wire transfer. Abigail would never see a single physical dollar pass through her personal bank accounts. She could not use my grandson's trust fund to buy designer handbags, lease luxury vehicles, or subsidize her lavish country club lunches. I legally guaranteed that the boy would have every single advantage I fought to build in this world, while simultaneously ensuring his mother remained entirely destitute. I instructed my wealth manager to send a certified copy of the trust framework directly to Abigail. I wanted her to read the exact terms of her financial quarantine. I wanted her to understand that her child was completely protected, but she was permanently locked out of the treasury. She had demanded $15,000 a month in cash to maintain her elite social status. Instead, she received a legally binding document proving she would have to get a minimum wage job just to feed herself. She could no longer use my grandchild as a bargaining chip. I secured my bloodline and simultaneously executed a flawless financial starvation tactic against the woman who tried to erase me. She was entirely neutralized, left to face the consequences of her overwhelming arrogance alone. She was completely cut off from the massive generational wealth she thought she had married into. Abigail was left completely isolated and entirely unfunded. She sat in a cheap hotel room holding a stack of legal documents that proved her extortion attempt had failed spectacularly. She had no money, no powerful father to rescue her, and an impending custody battle she could not possibly afford to fight. While Abigail realized the devastating reality of her situation, Darren was experiencing his own catastrophic mental breakdown. My son was still hiding in the filthy neon-lit motel room on the edge of the city. The 48-hour deadline to repay the $4.5 million commercial loan was rapidly closing in. He had exhausted every single contact in his elite social circle. He was completely out of options and staring down the barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Desperation breeds severe stupidity. Darren decided to launch one final pathetic offensive against me. My corporate desk phone rang loudly. I answered to hear Darren's voice trembling with a mix of raw panic and manufactured rage. He informed me that he had purchased a cheap, prepaid cellular device. He threatened to record a series of fabricated, out-of-context videos and broadcast them to local media outlets. He claimed he would go on camera and tell the world that I was suffering from severe dementia. He threatened to accuse me of financially abusing him and maliciously destroying his suburban home in a fit of senile rage. He thought he could weaponize my reputation against me. He believed the threat of public humiliation and corporate scandal would force me to forgive his massive debt. He was attempting to blackmail a man who had spent 4 decades crushing industrial competitors into dust. He had no idea I was holding the ultimate kill shot. My corporate office was completely quiet after Gavin departed to file the predatory custody petition against Abigail. I sat behind my heavy mahogany desk reviewing the blind trust documents that permanently secured my grandson's future. The financial quarantine was absolute. Abigail was entirely neutralized. But the 48-hour deadline I had given my son to repay the $4.5 million debt was rapidly ticking away. Darren was still hiding in a filthy neon-lit motel on the outskirts of the city. Desperation breeds severe stupidity. He had exhausted every single contact in his elite social circle and faced imminent federal incarceration. With his options obliterated, he decided to launch one final pathetic offensive against me. My private desk phone rang loudly. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. I answered the call and pressed the record button on my secure corporate server. Darren's voice erupted through the speaker. It was trembling with a volatile mixture of raw panic and manufactured rage. He informed me that he had purchased a cheap prepaid cellular device to avoid being tracked by my lawyers. He launched immediately into his desperate blackmail scheme. He threatened to release a series of highly edited out-of-context videos to local news outlets and major social media platforms. He claimed he would go on camera and tell the world that I was suffering from severe, rapid-onset dementia. He threatened to accuse me of financially abusing him and maliciously destroying his suburban home in a fit of senile rage. He thought he could weaponize my pristine commercial reputation against me. He believed the threat of public humiliation and a fabricated corporate scandal would force me to forgive his massive debt. He assumed a man who spent 40 years building a spotless business profile would instantly bow to cheap media extortion. He was attempting to blackmail a man who had spent decades crushing industrial competitors into dust. I did not raise my voice or interrupt his frantic monologue. I let him vividly describe exactly how the scandalous headlines would destroy my commercial refrigeration contracts and alienate my largest clients. When he finally ran out of breath, expecting me to beg for a truce, I delivered my response with absolute freezing precision. I informed him that his media strategy was completely useless. I had anticipated his false narrative the very moment I heard him plotting his psychiatric hold in the suburban dining room. I told Darren that 2 days ago I sat down with a panel of top-tier board-certified neurologists and psychiatrists. I underwent a grueling comprehensive cognitive examination. I possessed a fully certified notarized medical evaluation proving my mental acuity was absolutely flawless. I explained that this dense medical dossier was already securely filed with Gavin and my entire corporate legal team. I informed him that if any media outlet attempted to run his fabricated story, my lawyers would instantly serve them with the certified medical proof and a catastrophic defamation lawsuit that would bankrupt their network. I dismantled his entire blackmail leverage with a single undeniable medical fact. His threat of pushing a false dementia narrative was legally dead on arrival. The heavy silence on the burner phone confirmed his confidence was rapidly bleeding out. He realized he was trying to play chess against a man who had already cleared the entire board. I did not stop there. Defensive maneuvers only prolong a war. I decided to deliver the ultimate kill shot. I told Darren that I was not just holding defensive medical records. I possessed offensive, irrefutable evidence of his federal crimes. I informed my son that 6 months ago I had authorized a massive security upgrade to our corporate office systems. I had discreetly installed hidden high-definition 4K cameras directly above my executive desk. I described to Darren exactly what the encrypted video files contained. I painted a vivid picture of him sneaking into my private suite after hours. I detailed how the ultra-clear footage captured him sweating nervously, looking over his shoulder and practicing my signature on a scrap piece of paper. I told him the camera clearly recorded him stamping the fraudulent corporate seals onto the ironclad Capital commercial loan documents. The visual resolution was so pristine that the lending syndicate's logo and the specific loan amounts were entirely legible on the digital screen. I listened to his ragged breathing over the line as the reality of his absolute exposure settled into his bones. I did not ask him to surrender. I actively encouraged him to execute his threat. I challenged him to call the local news stations and upload his fabricated videos immediately. I promised him that the very second his lies went live on the internet, Gavin would simultaneously release the unedited security footage and the certified psychiatric evaluation to the public, the district attorney, and the managing director of Ironclad Capital. I offered him the specific choice to publicly broadcast his own federal crimes. I made it absolutely clear that his attempt to ruin my legacy had just provided me with the exact leverage required to ensure he spent the next 20 years locked inside a federal penitentiary. I told him the ball was entirely in his court, and I was eagerly waiting for his next move. Darren did not attempt to counter my challenge. He did not scream or offer another hollow threat. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the evidence completely crushed his remaining psychological defenses. He realized with absolute clarity that he was entirely outmatched. He was fighting a man who had built an empire by anticipating every possible angle of attack and neutralizing threats before they materialized. He dropped the prepaid burner phone. I heard the plastic device clatter loudly against the cheap laminate floor of his motel room before the line went completely dead. He was cornered, isolated, and entirely out of options. The 48-hour repayment deadline I had set for the $4.5 million debt was expiring in mere hours. He knew that the moment the clock struck zero, Gavin would officially transmit the massive forgery dossier to the county prosecutor. The prospect of facing a brutal federal trial and a lengthy sentence in a maximum security facility terrified him beyond rational thought. He looked at his ruined designer suit and the last few crumpled $20 bills in his wallet. He realized he could not face me in a courtroom. He could not face the ruthless shadow lenders he had defrauded, and he could not face the strict reality of the law. Driven by sheer, unadulterated panic, Darren made a fatal and reckless decision. He decided that his only remaining option was to vanish entirely. He abandoned the motel room, determined to slip across state lines before the federal arrest warrants could be formally issued. He grabbed his remaining belongings and sprinted toward the parking lot. He was about to initiate a desperate, highly illegal escape plan, completely unaware that his frantic flight would trigger the exact federal trap my legal team had already set for him. I kept my work boots pressed hard against the accelerator of my truck. I needed to cross the county line before the sun fully set. I had pushed Darren into a corner, completely stripping away his financial armor and threatening him with 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. I knew exactly how he would react. He was a coward who had built his entire life on the path of least resistance. He would never choose to face me, and he certainly would never choose to face the ruthless syndicate he had defrauded. He would run. I was banking on it. I pulled into a dusty 24-hour diner just off the interstate and ordered a black coffee. I sat in a vinyl booth watching the digital map on my phone. Gavin had officially transmitted the massive encrypted forgery dossier to the district attorney's office exactly 30 minutes ago. Darren had used the last of his physical cash to rent a beat-up, unremarkable sedan from a no-questions-asked lot on the edge of the city. He abandoned his custom-tailored suits and his ruined designer luggage, taking only what he could carry in a duffel bag. He merged onto the northbound interstate, driving furiously, attempting to cross state lines and disappear into the sprawling anonymity of the Midwest. He believed he was executing a brilliant escape. He did not realize his flight was the final fatal component of my strategy. By attempting to flee the jurisdiction after committing a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud, he triggered a severe legal escalation. He transformed a white-collar crime into an immediate federal flight risk. Gavin's transmission to the DA included Darren's driver's license, his social security number, and the newly established alert. The moment the county prosecutor opened the file, Darren's name flashed across the federal law enforcement database like a distress beacon. State troopers intercepted Darren's rental car exactly 42 miles from the state border. I listened to the police scanner application on my phone as the tactical units coordinated the stop. 3 marked cruisers boxed his sedan in on the shoulder of the desolate highway. Darren did not pull over smoothly. He slammed on the brakes, paralyzed by absolute terror as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror. The troopers did not approach his vehicle with polite requests for his registration. They drew their weapons and ordered him out of the car over a heavy loudspeaker. Darren stumbled out onto the cracked asphalt, his hands trembling violently as he raised them above his head. He was violently shoved against the rusted hood of the rental car and aggressively patted down. The troopers locked heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The arrogant executive vice president, who had casually plotted to lock his father in a psychiatric ward, was now being manhandled like a common street criminal. He was dragged into the back of a police cruiser, his face pressed against the cold plexiglass divider. The illusion of his elite status was permanently shattered. They processed Darren at the county jail just before midnight. He was stripped of his remaining personal items, fingerprinted, and placed in a bleak concrete holding cell. The reality of his complete isolation finally crushed his spirit. He had no powerful father-in-law to call. He had no elite friends willing to associate with a federal fugitive. He was entirely alone. He used his one constitutionally mandated phone call. My private cell phone vibrated on the diner table. I answered the call and listened to the automated voice recording from the county correctional facility. Darren's voice broke through the line, completely stripped of its former entitlement. He was sobbing openly, begging me to contact Gavin and arrange for his immediate bail. He promised he would do whatever I wanted if I just got him out of the concrete cell. I did not offer him false hope. I spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. I told him he was standing exactly where his choices had led him. I informed him that I would not interfere with the natural course of the law. I hung up the phone and finished my coffee. The arrest was secure. Tomorrow morning he would face the brutal consequences of his greed in open court. The heavy wooden doors of the county courthouse swung open the following morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow across the linoleum floor. The bailiff barked a sharp command and a line of inmates shuffled into the courtroom. Darren was the third man in the line. He wore an oversized, bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame, a stark contrast to the tailored Italian suits he usually paraded around in. Heavy steel shackles bound his wrists and ankles, clinking loudly with every hesitant step he took. The metallic sound echoed in the quiet room, a brutal reminder of his new reality. He looked disheveled, exhausted, and utterly terrified. His eyes immediately darted toward the spectator gallery. He frantically scanned the wooden pews, searching desperately for a familiar face. He was looking for his wife. He expected Abigail to be sitting in the front row with her wealthy father and a team of high-priced defense attorneys ready to post his bail. He expected his elite country club friends to be standing by to offer their support and outrage over his mistreatment. His eyes swept across the left side of the room, then the right. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The pews were completely empty. Not a single person from his carefully curated high society life had shown up to support him. Abigail had abandoned him entirely. Her father had severed all ties to protect his own wealth. Darren's network of elite allies had evaporated the second his bank accounts were frozen. He was entirely alone. I sat in the very back row of the gallery, positioned squarely in the shadows near the heavy oak exit doors. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight and my hands resting calmly on my knees. I did not wave to my son. I did not offer a sympathetic smile or a reassuring nod. I simply sat in absolute silence, watching the devastating consequences of his unchecked arrogance unfold before my eyes. Darren finally noticed me sitting in the back. His eyes locked onto mine, widening in a mixture of profound shock and desperate pleading. He silently mouthed a plea for help, silently begging me to intervene and end his nightmare. I did not react. I maintained the cold, impassive expression of a man evaluating a broken piece of commercial machinery. He needed to understand that the protective safety net he had abused for his entire adult life had been permanently dismantled. I had spent decades shielding him from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of the real world. I had absorbed the financial blows and insulated him from the fallout of his own mistakes. That era was officially over. By sitting in the back of the courtroom as a silent observer, I was delivering a message clearer than any spoken word. I was showing him that I would no longer step between him and the fire he had intentionally set. He had chosen to view my generosity as weakness. He had chosen to forge my signature and attempt to lock me away in a psychiatric ward to steal my legacy. Now he had to face the brutal machinery of the federal justice system entirely on his own. I watched his shoulders slump forward as the bailiff directed him to sit at the defense table. The crushing weight of his absolute isolation finally settled into his bones. The judge, an older man with a severe and uncompromising demeanor, slammed his wooden gavel and called the docket. The county prosecutor stood up and approached the center podium. She did not mince words. She laid out the sheer magnitude of Darren's crimes with surgical precision. She detailed the forged corporate seals, the fake notary stamps, and the $4.5 million commercial loan he had fraudulently secured from a shadow lending syndicate. She painted a vivid picture of a greedy, manipulative executive who had brazenly stolen his own father's identity to fund his catastrophic business failures. Darren sat frozen next to his overworked public defender, shrinking under the devastating weight of the public accusations. He had no defense. The forensic audit Gavin had transmitted was irrefutable, but the prosecutor was not finished. She shifted her focus from the corporate fraud to the events of the previous afternoon. She informed the judge that Darren had used cash to rent a vehicle and attempted to flee the jurisdiction. She described the felony traffic stop on the interstate, highlighting that state troopers had to extract him from the vehicle at gunpoint because he was actively trying to cross state lines to avoid prosecution. She argued aggressively that Darren was an extreme flight risk, who possessed the knowledge to manipulate financial systems and hide assets. The public defender stood up and weakly requested a personal recognizance bond, citing Darren's lack of prior criminal history. The judge cut the defender off immediately. He looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. He stated that a man who steals millions from his own family and attempts to run from the law is a danger to the community and a guaranteed flight risk. The judge denied the request for a personal recognizance bond without a second thought. He set bail at an impossible $1.5 million, payable only in cash. A collective gasp echoed from the few reporters sitting in the courtroom. Darren buried his face in his shackled hands. The bailiff grabbed Darren by the arm and hauled him up from the defense table. Without the impossible sum of $1.5 million in liquid cash, Darren was remanded directly to the county system. He was not sent back to the temporary holding cells. Because of the massive federal wire fraud flags attached to his profile and the high flight risk designation, the transport officers marched him straight to the maximum security block. I stood up from my seat in the back row and walked out of the courtroom, listening to the heavy steel doors slam shut behind my son. Darren was placed in a crowded, windowless cell block alongside hardened criminals. The sheer, terrifying reality of his new environment completely shattered his remaining psychological defenses. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, and the elite country club dinners were entirely gone, replaced by the relentless, deafening noise of the penitentiary and the stark threat of violence. He realized with absolute clarity that he would not survive 20 years in a federal prison. He had no leverage, no money, and no allies left in the world. The isolation broke him down to his absolute core. Within 48 hours of his arraignment, the intense psychological pressure crushed his final shreds of pride. He summoned his public defender to the visitation room in a state of sheer panic. He begged the overworked lawyer to contact my corporate legal team immediately. He pleaded with the attorney to set up an emergency face-to-face meeting with me. He was finally ready to surrender everything just to avoid spending the next 2 decades behind bars. He knew I was the only man on earth holding the keys to his salvation, and he was finally prepared to beg for mercy. I walked into the sterile, heavily fortified visitation room of the county correctional facility, with Gavin walking silently in step beside me. The room smelled of harsh industrial bleach and raw desperation. We sat down in the rigid metal chairs bolted to the concrete floor and waited behind the thick slab of reinforced security glass. 5 minutes later, a heavy steel door clanked open on the opposite side of the barrier. A pair of armed corrections officers escorted my son into the cramped booth. Darren was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant executive who had casually boarded a luxury cruise ship just weeks prior. His bright orange uniform hung loosely off his emaciated frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken into deep, dark hollows, and his hands trembled violently as he picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. I lifted my receiver and held it to my ear, waiting for him to speak. He did not lead with a greeting or a show of respect. He immediately began to sob, his voice cracking against the static of the prison phone line. He begged Gavin to orchestrate a plea deal with the aggressive federal prosecutors. He pleaded with me to drop the civil pursuit of the $4.5 million debt, terrified that the financial enhancements would guarantee him a 20-year sentence. He promised he would do absolutely anything I asked if I just gave him a second chance to make things right. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply stared at him through the smudged plexiglass, completely immune to his theatrical performance. When Darren realized his tears were crashing against a solid brick wall, his desperation instantly mutated into a vicious defensive anger. He wiped his face with the back of his shackled wrist and attempted to deploy the exact same emotional manipulation he had used to control Abigail and her wealthy parents. He leaned closer to the glass and hissed that I was entirely responsible for his current catastrophic situation. He accused me of being a cold, absent father who cared more about maintaining commercial refrigeration units than raising his own child. He claimed I had abandoned him to build my corporate empire, leaving him alone to navigate the immense pressures of high society without proper guidance. He shouted that I had deliberately set him up to fail by placing him in an executive position he was never trained to handle, just so I could maintain absolute dictatorial control over his life. He twisted the narrative with the desperate skill of a cornered predator trying to gaslight me into accepting the blame for his massive federal crimes. He told me that my obsession with wealth and legacy had forced him to seek validation and capital from outside sources. He spat that I loved my bank accounts and my fleet of service trucks far more than I ever loved my own flesh and blood. He firmly believed that attacking my guilt as a father would force me to open my wallet and buy his freedom. I let his pathetic, venomous accusations hang in the stale air of the visitation booth. I did not raise my voice or rush to defend my parenting. I dismantled his entire fabricated reality with icy, unforgiving precision. I leaned forward and told him exactly what my absence had purchased. I described the grueling 80-hour work weeks I endured throughout the 1990s. I reminded him of the brutal, freezing winters I spent crawling through the ventilation shafts of industrial warehouses while he slept comfortably in a custom-built bedroom. I told him about the countless times I stood in pristine corporate boardrooms and swallowed vile, thinly veiled racist insults from arrogant suppliers just to keep my supply chains open and my contracts active. I absorbed every single piece of humiliation and disrespect the commercial market threw at a black business owner, so I could afford the exorbitant $50,000 annual tuition for his elite private academies. I explained that I bled on concrete floors to ensure he would never have to experience the suffocating weight of poverty and systemic rejection that defined my own youth. I provided him with a flawless, debt-free education and handed him a six-figure executive salary the very moment he graduated. I told Darren that I gave him the exact privilege I had desperately fought for, and he had completely squandered it on cheap status symbols. I stared directly into his sunken eyes and delivered the absolute truth. I told him he mistook privilege for a birthright. He believed he was entitled to the empire without ever having to lift a heavy wrench or sacrifice a single hour of his comfort. I made it absolutely clear that my hard work was not the cause of his federal incarceration. His own unchecked ravenous greed was the sole reason he was sitting in a maximum security holding cell. The brutal reality of my words completely shattered his final psychological defense. Darren slumped back in his metal chair, the remaining defiance draining entirely from his posture. He could no longer hide behind his manufactured victimhood or blame his environment for his choices. He looked at me with the hollow, defeated realization of a man who had finally run out of lies. The silence stretched between us, thick and absolute, broken only by the muffled shouts of other inmates echoing down the concrete corridor. He asked me in a raspy, broken whisper what I wanted him to do. I did not answer him directly. I turned my head and nodded to Gavin. My corporate litigator unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a single, densely typed legal document. Gavin slid the heavy parchment through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the security glass. The document rested on the metal ledge in front of my son, like a loaded weapon. I looked at Darren and informed him that I was willing to intervene and save him from spending the next 2 decades rotting in a federal penitentiary. I told him I would instruct Gavin to formally drop the civil pursuit of the $4.5 million debt, which would drastically reduce the federal sentencing guidelines he currently faced. But that salvation came with a permanent, non-negotiable cost. He had to read the document sitting in front of him. It was the ultimate contract of surrender designed to permanently sever him from my life and my legacy. I waited for him to pick up the pen, knowing he was about to sign away his entire future. I remained seated behind the thick pane of security glass, my expression fixed and unreadable. I looked at the broken man in the orange jumpsuit who had once believed he was entitled to my entire empire. Darren's hands trembled violently as he clutched the heavy black telephone receiver to his ear. I did not raise my voice when I spoke. I delivered the precise terms of my intervention with the clinical detachment of a corporate negotiation. I informed him that I was willing to instruct Gavin to formally withdraw the civil pursuit regarding the $4.5 million debt. I explained the exact legal implications of this action. By dropping the civil lawsuit and removing myself as the primary financial victim seeking direct restitution, the federal sentencing guidelines would shift drastically in his favor. The prosecutor would lose the leverage of the harshest financial fraud enhancements. This single legal maneuver would effectively save him from serving 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. I watched the realization dawn on his gaunt face. He understood that I was offering him a lifeline, a way to survive the catastrophic collapse of his own making. He nodded frantically, promising he would do whatever was necessary to secure the deal. I did not let his desperate promises interrupt the flow of my conditions. I leaned closer to the glass and laid out the absolute cost of his salvation. In exchange for my intervention, Darren was required to sign a comprehensive, legally binding confession detailing every aspect of the forgery and the fraudulent commercial loan. But the confession was merely the baseline requirement. I instructed Gavin, who sat silently beside me, to slide the final document through the narrow metal slot beneath the security glass. I told Darren to read the paperwork carefully. It was an irrevocable forfeiture agreement. By signing the document, Darren would permanently surrender any future claim to my commercial heating and refrigeration company. He would explicitly forfeit his position as a corporate officer, his executive pension, and any legal right to contest my decisions regarding the business. The agreement extended beyond the corporate realm. It mandated that he renounce any claim to my personal estate, my private trusts, and any inheritance he might have anticipated upon my death. He would walk out of the federal facility with absolutely nothing. No safety net, no trust fund, no corporate backing. He would be entirely severed from the generational wealth I had spent 40 years building from the ground up. Darren stared at the dense legal text resting on the metal ledge. His eyes scanned the unyielding paragraphs that officially stripped away his entire identity. He realized the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of what he had casually thrown away in his blind pursuit of unearned luxury. He thought about the sprawling suburban house that was now a leveled construction site. He thought about the high society network that had abandoned him the moment his credit cards declined. He thought about the corporate empire he had intended to steal, an empire built on the very concrete floors he had despised. His chest heaved as a profound, agonizing sob tore through his throat. The tears spilled over his hollow cheeks, dripping onto the pristine white paper. He was no longer the arrogant executive vice president projecting an illusion of power. He was a terrified, bankrupt criminal facing the absolute reality of his actions. He picked up the cheap plastic pen provided by the corrections officer. His hand shook so severely he could barely control the ink, but he knew he had no other option. He pressed the pen to the signature line and scrawled his name across the bottom of the forfeiture agreement. He signed away his legacy, his comfort, and his unearned privilege. He pushed the document back through the metal slot, his head bowed, in total crushing defeat. He had officially surrendered everything. Gavin retrieved the signed confession and the forfeiture agreement, sliding them securely into his leather briefcase. I stood up from the rigid metal chair and hung the telephone receiver back on its cradle. I did not offer Darren a final word of comfort or a sympathetic goodbye. I turned my back on the visitation booth and walked down the long, sterile concrete corridor toward the main exit. The heavy steel doors of the county correctional facility slammed shut behind me, echoing with a hollow finality. The brutal legal war I had waged against my own son was officially won. I had protected my assets, dismantled the predatory shadow syndicate, and neutralized the existential threat to my legacy. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight and walked toward my rusted work truck. I felt a profound sense of closure, but my task was not entirely finished. The corporate structure of my commercial refrigeration empire was still compromised. Darren had spent years filling the middle management ranks with lazy, entitled cronies who shared his disdain for hard labor and blue-collar grit. They were a lingering infection spreading through the veins of my company. I climbed into the cab of my truck and turned the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life. I shifted the truck into gear and drove aggressively toward my flagship warehouse. It was time to execute a ruthless corporate purge and restore the integrity of the business I had bled to build. The corporate purge effectively stabilized my commercial refrigeration empire, but the lingering fallout from my son's catastrophic choices required one final definitive intervention in family court. Gavin and I arrived at a neutral mediation facility downtown early Tuesday morning. We stepped into a sleek, sterile conference room overlooking the city skyline. Abigail sat at the opposite end of the long glass table. She was flanked by two aggressive, high-priced divorce attorneys funded entirely by the last remnants of her father's secret emergency cash. She wore a tailored designer suit projecting a desperate, fragile illusion of absolute control. Her lead attorney did not offer a polite greeting. He immediately slid a thick legal motion across the polished glass. He announced with supreme arrogance that his client was officially filing to seize half of the financial proceeds from the liquidated suburban property. He boldly claimed the sprawling house I had purchased was a primary marital asset. He argued that since the property was sold for cash during the legal marriage, Abigail was rightfully entitled to 50% of the exact liquidation value to maintain her established standard of living. He demanded a certified cashier's check by the end of the business week, threatening to drag me into a protracted, highly publicized civil battle if I refused to settle. Abigail crossed her arms and offered a cold, triumphant smile. She firmly believed she had finally discovered a hidden legal loophole to bypass the impenetrable blind trust I had established for my grandson. She thought she had cornered me. I did not react to her manufactured smugness or her attorney's hollow threats. I simply looked at Gavin. My corporate litigator did not even bother to sit down. He unclasped his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew a single highly certified document. He bypassed her aggressive lawyers entirely and slid the crisp paper directly in front of Abigail. Gavin informed the opposing counsel that they had made a catastrophic error in their foundational research. He explained with brutal, surgical precision that the demolished suburban house was never registered under Darren's name. It was never a personal asset, and it was certainly never a marital acquisition. Gavin produced a secondary stack of certified corporate tax filings. He pointed to the highlighted federal asset registers. He proved irrefutably that the property was purchased, maintained, and legally owned exclusively by my commercial corporate trust. I had simply permitted my son to reside in the company asset as an untaxed occupational fringe benefit. Because Darren possessed zero legal equity in the property, the structure never belonged to the marriage. Gavin leaned over the table and explicitly stated that zero marital assets existed to be divided. The cash generated from the brutal same-day demolition sale had been legally wired directly back into the protective shield of my private commercial holding company. The lead divorce attorney snatched the corporate tax records from the table. His eyes rapidly scanned the unyielding federal documents. The aggressive color completely drained from his face as he realized his firm was attempting to seize a corporate asset they had absolutely no jurisdiction over. Abigail's triumphant smile instantly collapsed. She looked frantically at her expensive legal team, demanding they file an immediate countermotion. Her lawyers remained completely silent, realizing they were fighting an unwinnable war against a perfectly insulated financial fortress. Gavin did not give them a single moment to recover from the devastating legal blow. He pulled a final, densely typed financial dossier from his briefcase and dropped it heavily onto the center of the glass table. He informed Abigail that while she possessed absolutely no legal claim to my corporate wealth, the state marital dissolution laws did guarantee her an equal division of something else. Gavin explained that a legal marriage requires the equal distribution of all shared liabilities acquired during the union. He opened the folder to reveal the exact staggering depth of my son's catastrophic financial ruin. He presented the certified accounting of Darren's massive legal debts, his completely drained checking accounts, and the lingering tax penalties associated with his failed technology startup. Gavin looked directly into Abigail's eyes and delivered the absolute crushing reality. She was legally entitled to exactly 50% of a bankrupt criminal's massive negative net worth. The two high-priced divorce attorneys instantly recognized the fatal danger of the situation. They were representing a woman with zero liquid capital, zero actionable assets, and a mountain of impending legal debt. They realized with absolute clarity that they would never see a single dime for their billable hours. The lead attorney aggressively shoved the tax documents back toward Abigail. He briskly packed his briefcase, muttered a sharp, furious excuse about a conflict of interest, and walked out of the mediation room without a backward glance. His partner immediately followed, abandoning their destitute client right at the table. Abigail sat entirely alone in the massive conference room. The pristine illusion of her elite high society life was permanently shattered into a million jagged pieces. She had attempted to extort a man who built his entire empire by anticipating every possible angle of attack. She slowly stood up on trembling legs. She grabbed her designer handbag and walked out of the building, completely broke, trapped by the relentless weight of her own unparalleled greed. She was finally forced to face a harsh, unforgiving world without my wallet to shield her. I remained seated at the mediation table, listening to the sharp, frantic clicking of Abigail's heels echoing down the sterile marble hallway until the sound completely vanished. The financial parasites that had relentlessly drained my resources and plotted my mental destruction were now entirely neutralized. They had been systematically stripped of their power, their assets, and their social standing. I stood up, shook Gavin's hand, and walked out of the building. The suffocating weight I had carried for years was permanently gone. I returned to the grease-stained floor of my flagship warehouse. I poured my energy back into the massive commercial refrigeration units, finding a deep restorative peace in the rhythmic hum of industrial machinery. The business flourished under the new hard-working leadership team I had promoted. The autumn months passed with a quiet, undeniable clarity. The leaves turned a brittle brown and fell from the oak trees lining the interstate. The relentless legal machinery of the federal justice system continued to turn in the background. The day I had silently anticipated finally arrived. It was the scheduled date for Darren's formal federal sentencing. My son had spent months sitting in a bleak county holding cell, entirely stripped of his unearned privilege, waiting to learn exactly how much of his life would be claimed by the federal penitentiary system. He had signed the absolute confession. He had surrendered his entire legacy. Now a federal judge would decide his ultimate fate. I put on my tailored charcoal suit and drove toward the towering federal courthouse. I prepared to witness the final irreversible consequence of my son's staggering betrayal. The era of his entitlement was officially over and the final judgment was at hand. I settled into my sturdy leather office chair, listening to the sharp, rapid clatter of Abigail's designer heels fading down the polished marble corridor. The sound diminished until it was entirely swallowed by the hum of the downtown traffic outside the window. The parasitic entities that had aggressively drained my financial resources and casually plotted my permanent confinement in a psychiatric ward were now completely neutralized. Darren and Abigail had been systematically stripped of their unearned power, their stolen assets, and their hollow social standing. They were left to face the brutal consequences of the real world entirely on their own. I stood up and extended my hand to Gavin across the long glass conference table. My corporate litigator offered a firm nod of absolute professional satisfaction. We had executed a flawless defensive strategy. We walked out of the mediation facility together, leaving the wreckage of my son's entitlement securely locked in the past. The suffocating and heavy burden I had carried for the last 5 years vanished completely. The constant exhausting pressure of attempting to purchase my son's affection and shield him from his own incompetence evaporated. I returned to the grease-stained floor of my flagship commercial refrigeration warehouse that very afternoon. I poured my renewed energy directly back into the massive industrial units, finding a deep restorative peace in the rhythmic thrum of commercial machinery. The business flourished under the newly promoted hard-working leadership team. The toxic atmosphere Darren had cultivated in middle management was permanently eradicated. The autumn months passed with a quiet and undeniable clarity. The leaves on the oak trees lining the interstate turned a brittle brown and fell to the pavement. But the relentless legal machinery of the federal justice system continued to grind forward in the background, constantly processing the final stages of Darren's monumental fraud case. The day I had silently anticipated for half a year finally arrived. It was the scheduled date for Darren's formal federal sentencing hearing. My son had spent the last 6 months sitting in a bleak county holding cell, entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his unearned privilege. He had waited in total isolation to learn exactly how much of his life would be claimed by the federal penitentiary system. He had signed the absolute confession detailing his massive commercial forgery. He had legally surrendered his entire legacy and his position in my corporate empire. Now, a federal judge would decide his ultimate fate. I put on my best charcoal suit and drove my truck toward the towering federal courthouse downtown. I parked and walked through the heavy security checkpoints, preparing to witness the final, irreversible consequence of my son's staggering betrayal. The era of his blinding entitlement was officially over, and the final legal judgment was at hand. I took a seat in the very back row of the spectator gallery, choosing a spot shrouded in the shadows near the heavy oak exit doors. The courtroom was sparse and sterile. Darren was escorted into the room by 2 armed federal marshals. He wore a standard-issue khaki prison uniform, his hands and ankles securely shackled. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of his reality. The federal judge, a stern woman with a reputation for merciless sentences, reviewed the massive legal dossier resting on her bench. She noted the scale of the $4.5 million commercial forgery and the deliberate attempt to flee the state jurisdiction. However, she also noted the signed confession and the fact that I, as the primary victim, had officially dropped the civil pursuit of the stolen funds. Because I removed myself as the financial victim seeking direct monetary restitution, the judge applied a minor leniency to the federal sentencing guidelines. She slammed her wooden gavel and delivered the final ruling. Darren was sentenced to 4 years in a minimum security federal facility, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored probation. The sentence was a fraction of the 20 years he originally faced, but it was still a devastating blow to a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. As the bailiff stepped forward to escort Darren out of the courtroom, my son turned his head and looked directly at me in the gallery. He did not yell or plead. I offered him a single slow nod. It was not a gesture of victory or gloating. It was a silent acknowledgement of a necessary and deeply painful correction. I remained in my seat until the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind him, completely closing the book on his former life. I drove my restored truck down the long stretch of federal highway leading to the minimum security correctional facility. 6 months had passed since the judge slammed her wooden gavel and sealed my son's fate. The massive iron gates loomed in the distance against a pale morning sky. I parked in the designated visitor lot and walked through the sterile security checkpoints. The guards directed me to a stark visitation room filled with bolted plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting. I took a seat at a small metallic table. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the room buzzed open. Darren walked in. He wore a faded khaki uniform that hung loosely over his shoulders. The arrogant posture he used to project in bespoke suits was completely gone. He sat across from me. He placed his hands flat on the cold metal table. I looked down at his fingers. The soft manicured skin that had never known a day of physical labor was now calloused and rough. He had been assigned to the prison laundry facility, hauling heavy wet canvas and operating industrial pressing machines for pennies an hour. The physical reality of manual labor had stripped away the pristine facade of the executive vice president. He looked older, entirely stripped of the unearned privilege that had fueled his staggering betrayal. He did not look away from my gaze. He met my eyes with a quiet, defeated exhaustion. The silence stretched between us for a long moment before he finally spoke. Darren took a slow breath and leaned forward. He told me he was truly sorry. It was the first time in his entire adult life that I heard him utter an apology completely devoid of manipulation. There was no whining about his harsh circumstances and no attempt to shift the blame onto his former wife or her greedy family. He spoke with a quiet, heavy sincerity. He admitted that he had spent the last 6 months stripping away his own delusions while folding coarse prison uniforms. He confessed that he ruined his own life because he firmly believed he deserved absolute luxury without ever breaking a sweat to build it. He told me he had looked around his crowded cell block and realized he was no different from the men he used to mock from the windows of his expensive corporate office. He acknowledged the staggering depth of his betrayal. He admitted that forging my signature to steal millions of dollars was the ultimate act of cowardice. He recognized that trying to lock me inside a psychiatric ward just to protect his fragile ego was monstrous. He looked down at his rough hands and stated that he finally understood the sheer weight of the empire I had built. He told me he knew he had thrown away a pristine legacy simply because he lacked the basic character required to maintain it. The sterile visitation room absorbed his confession. He was not asking for a legal pardon or a reduction in his sentence. He was simply stating the cold facts of his own destruction. The crushing environment of the federal penitentiary had forcefully extracted the toxic entitlement from his blood. He had finally met the harsh reality I had shielded him from his entire life. I listened to his confession without interrupting. When he finished speaking, I offered a single, firm nod. I told Darren that I accepted his apology. I recognized the genuine remorse in his voice, but I also knew that forgiveness did not mean erasing the consequences of his bad actions. I leaned across the cold metal table and established the permanent boundaries of our new reality. I informed him with absolute clarity that there was no hidden trust fund waiting for him upon his release. I stated that the commercial heating and refrigeration company he tried to steal was thriving under new leadership and his executive position was permanently eliminated. I told him he would not return to a corner office or a corporate vehicle. He would walk out of the federal gates in 3.5 years with a criminal record and exactly whatever money he managed to save from his prison laundry wages. I looked directly into his eyes and explained that cutting him off financially was the only way to save his life. I told him I refused to subsidize his weakness ever again. If he wanted to rebuild his life, he would have to do it with his own calloused hands. He would have to secure a minimum wage job, find a modest apartment, and learn how to survive in the very world he had spent his life looking down upon. I told him that I would not pay his rent, I would not co-sign a loan, and I would not bail him out of his future mistakes. He was a grown man, and he would finally have to earn his own way. Darren did not argue. He did not beg for a safety net or plead for a small allowance. He simply nodded, accepting the heavy terms of his new existence. He understood that my refusal to fund his life was the ultimate act of paternal love. I was finally giving him the vital opportunity to build his own character from the absolute bottom. The harsh buzzer echoed through the busy visitation hall, signaling the end of the strictly allotted hour. A stern corrections officer stepped forward to escort the inmates back to their bleak cell blocks. Darren stood up slowly from the cold metal chair. He looked at me one final time, offering a quiet expression of genuine, profound respect. He turned around and walked back through the heavy steel door, the iron shackles around his ankles dragging lightly against the rough concrete floor. I remained seated for a moment, letting the profound silence wash over my mind. The long parasitic era was officially closed forever. I stood up and walked down the long, sterile corridor toward the main facility exit. I pushed through the heavy security glass doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The winter air was crisp and completely clear. I walked across the vast concrete parking lot toward my truck, feeling the immense crushing weight of the past 40 years finally lifting from my tired shoulders. I had spent my entire adult life building a massive commercial empire, fighting brutal systemic discrimination and desperately trying to protect a son who used my sacrifices as a reckless weapon against me. I had waged a ruthless legal war to dismantle his unchecked greed and completely secure my own hard-earned legacy. Now the battlefield was entirely quiet. The financial vampires were permanently neutralized, and my grandson's future was locked securely inside an impenetrable blind trust. I climbed into the cab of my truck and placed my hands on the worn leather steering wheel. The future was a beautiful blank slate. For the first time in my long life, I was completely free from crushing obligation. I was ready to live the rest of my days entirely on my own terms. The transition from the prison parking lot to a steady, quiet life was completely seamless. I did not fill my newly empty schedule with chaotic distractions or meaningless luxury. I embraced the profound silence that now governed my days. I woke up each morning before the sun crested the horizon, driven by the ingrained rhythm of a man who had spent 4 decades building a commercial empire. But instead of rushing to the flagship warehouse to extinguish corporate fires, I took my time. I began frequenting a quiet, unassuming diner located a few miles from the bustling city center. It was a comfortable place where working people gathered before their shifts, smelling of fresh roasted coffee and fried bacon. The waitresses knew my regular order and respected my quiet demeanor. It was during these tranquil, undisturbed mornings that I officially met Josephine. She was a retired pediatric nurse who spent her mornings reading thick hardcover novels in the vinyl booth adjacent to mine. She had warm, perceptive eyes and a gentle laugh that carried a lifetime of hard-earned wisdom. We began with simple, polite nods across the narrow aisle. Those brief acknowledgments eventually evolved into sharing a full pot of coffee. Josephine possessed a quiet strength that immediately drew me in. She did not wear designer clothing or project an artificial aura of elite status. She wore simple, elegant dresses and spoke with the grounded authenticity of someone who had spent her entire life healing actual physical wounds. Josephine knew absolutely nothing about my massive commercial refrigeration company or my multi-million-dollar corporate trusts. To her, I was simply Edgar, a retired mechanic with calloused hands who appreciated a strong cup of black coffee and a quiet morning routine. I deliberately kept the vast scale of my financial empire entirely out of our conversations. I wanted to experience a relationship built exclusively on mutual respect and genuine human connection. We bonded over our shared blue-collar backgrounds and our mutual appreciation for enduring craftsmanship. We spent our afternoons walking through the local botanical gardens, discussing the profound value of hard work and quiet resilience. When I mentioned my passion for restoring classic American muscle cars, her eyes lit up with genuine interest. She told me vivid stories about her father, a proud man who had spent his weekends rebuilding heavy engines in his narrow driveway. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, entirely devoid of the toxic transactional subtext that had poisoned my interactions with my son and his high society in-laws. She never asked about my investment portfolio. She never dropped subtle hints about needing financial assistance or upgrading her personal lifestyle. She simply enjoyed my company for the man I was, not the bank account I commanded. It was a completely pure dynamic, entirely untainted by the relentless, suffocating greed I had spent the last 5 years battling. For the first time in decades, I did not have to analyze a conversation for hidden motives or defensive legal strategies. I was finally experiencing the profound, unadulterated joy of an authentic partnership. Josephine valued the deep scars on my hands, recognizing them as the honorable marks of a life spent building something real. Late one Saturday afternoon, I stood alone inside my private residential garage. The air was thick with the sharp, familiar scent of carnauba wax and premium motor oil. I was methodically polishing the sleek, jet-black hood of my fully restored 1968 Mustang Fastback. The heavy fluorescent workshop lights reflected perfectly off the flawless mirror-like paint job. I dragged the microfiber cloth in slow, rhythmic circles, allowing the repetitive physical motion to ground my racing thoughts. My mind drifted back over the chaotic, destructive events of the past year. I thought about the towering chain-link fence surrounding the demolished suburban house. I thought about the absolute panic in Abigail's eyes when my corporate litigator dismantled her pathetic extortion attempt. I thought about Darren sitting in a minimum security federal penitentiary, finally learning how to fold industrial laundry for pennies an hour. Society might view my ruthless legal and financial tactics as cold or exceptionally vindictive. They might judge a father for systematically stripping his own son of every single worldly comfort and allowing him to face a federal judge without a safety net. But standing there in the quiet solitude of my garage, I knew the absolute truth. Destroying Darren's false, arrogant reality was not an act of vengeance. It was the ultimate, most profound act of fatherly love I could have possibly delivered. I had firmly refused to let him continue living a lie built entirely on my sweat. By entirely cutting off the endless flow of unearned capital, I had successfully stopped him from transforming into a complete monster. I had surgically removed the toxic privilege that was actively poisoning his character. I had forced him to face the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the real world. By breaking him down to his absolute foundation, I had finally given my son the genuine opportunity to build himself back up as an honorable man. I had saved his soul by destroying his bank account. I tossed the polishing cloth onto a heavy metal workbench. I opened the driver's side door of the Mustang and slid into the immaculate vintage leather seat. I gripped the wooden steering wheel, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of a powerful machine I had rebuilt with my own 2 hands. I inserted the silver key into the ignition and turned it forward. The massive V8 engine roared to life instantly. The deep guttural rumble shook the concrete floor of the garage, a powerful symphony of raw mechanical strength and perfect calibration. I engaged the heavy transmission and backed the car out into the fading afternoon light. The vast sky above the distant city skyline was beginning to burn with brilliant streaks of vibrant orange and deep, violent violet. I shifted gears and drove toward the open highway. The wind rushed through the open windows, carrying away the final lingering traces of the past 5 years. My commercial refrigeration empire was thriving under dedicated, hard-working leadership. My newborn grandson was permanently protected by an impenetrable financial fortress entirely safe from his mother's desperate greed. The parasitic entities that had tried to drain my life and lock me away in the dark were entirely eradicated. I merged onto the fast lane, pressing my heavy boot down on the accelerator. The powerful car surged forward effortlessly, eating up the miles of open black asphalt. I watched the golden sun dip below the horizon in my rearview mirror. My legacy was completely secure. My dignity was perfectly intact. I drove straight into the beautiful evening, enveloped by an absolute unbreakable peace. I was a man who had fought through the darkest storms, and I had finally earned the right to enjoy the quiet clarity of the open road ahead. Looking out over the gleaming hood of my restored Mustang, I find myself deeply reflecting on the fundamental nature of parental sacrifice. For decades, I firmly believed that the ultimate duty of a father was to absorb the brutal impact of the world, so his children would never have to feel the sting of its cruelty. I spent 40 years inhaling the toxic fumes of industrial solvents, lifting heavy commercial refrigeration units, until my spinal column ached and swallowing the bitter poison of systemic banking discrimination. I did all of this to build an impenetrable financial fortress around my family. I wanted to ensure that my son Darren would never know the suffocating weight of poverty that defined my own youth in the inner city. I provided him with an immaculate education, an elite suburban home, and a lucrative executive salary that he never had to earn through genuine sweat. I thought I was insulating him from suffering. I did not realize that by removing every single obstacle from his path, I was actively denying him the opportunity to develop a functional moral compass. I handed him the heavy crown of my commercial empire without ever requiring him to forge the strength necessary to carry it. The tragic irony of my life is that my relentless generosity became the very poison that corrupted my son. He grew up believing that extreme privilege was a basic birthright rather than a fragile gift secured by the literal blood and tears of his hardworking father. We often confuse financial security with familial loyalty. I assumed that by paying Darren's exorbitant property taxes and funding his luxurious international vacations, I was permanently cementing our bond. Instead, I was merely funding my own eventual betrayal. The money did not buy his respect. The wealth only amplified his inherent arrogance and attracted parasites like Abigail and her deeply corrupt father. They looked at my calloused hands and my faded work jackets with absolute disgust, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that those very hands financed their designer wardrobes and their exclusive country club memberships. They lived in a hollow, artificial reality governed exclusively by social status and shallow material accumulation. They believed that because I was a quiet blue-collar man who actively avoided high society galas, I was inherently weak and easily manipulated. They fundamentally misunderstood the profound difference between a man who is silent out of ignorance and a man who is silent because he is meticulously observing his surroundings. I watched them mistake my paternal patience for cognitive decline. They assumed they could quietly lock me inside a clinical psychiatric facility and strip my assets without facing a single consequence. They vastly underestimated the survival instincts of a man who built an entire commercial enterprise from the ground up in a hostile world explicitly designed to crush him. They awoke a sleeping giant because they were blinded by their own insatiable greed and their unearned fragile superiority complex. When the ultimate betrayal was finally revealed to me, I did not react with explosive rage. Shouting and screaming are the desperate weapons of the powerless. I chose the path of the silent adjustment. I approached the destruction of my son's false reality with the exact same clinical precision I used to diagnose a catastrophic failure in a commercial cooling system. You do not argue with a broken machine. You systematically isolate the corrupted components, sever the power supply, and replace the failing parts. I dismantled Darren's entire existence using the very legal and financial frameworks he attempted to weaponize against me. I liquidated his sanctuary, seized his luxury vehicles, froze his platinum credit cards, and purchased his illicit multi-million-dollar debt. I did not do this out of malicious vindictiveness. I executed this total financial erasure because it was the only language a man consumed by monetary greed could possibly understand. I had to reduce his artificial world to absolute rubble so he could finally see the rotting foundation of lies he had been standing upon. True justice is rarely poetic or gentle. True justice is a harsh, unforgiving mirror that forces the guilty to look directly at their own monstrous reflections without any protective filters. By orchestrating his downfall, I protected the integrity of the business I bled for and ensured that the people who relied on my company for their livelihoods would not suffer because of my son's staggering incompetence and malice. The dust has finally settled across the battlefield of my personal life. The commercial heating and refrigeration company is currently experiencing its most profitable fiscal quarter in over a decade. The toxic, entitled middle management executives Darren hired have been permanently replaced by the hardworking, dedicated floor mechanics who actually understand the immense value of honest labor. The corporate culture has been entirely cleansed of its parasitic infection. My newborn grandson is completely shielded by an ironclad, impenetrable, blind trust. He will receive a premium education and absolute medical security, but he will never become a pawn in his mother's desperate extortion schemes. Abigail was forced to face the brutal reality of the world without my checking account to protect her. She left the family court mediation room entirely penniless, trapped by her own staggering arrogance and the overwhelming legal debts she accrued trying to fight a man she could not defeat. Her wealthy father retreated into the shadows, terrified of the federal tax evasion evidence I hold securely in my corporate vault. The external threats to my legacy have been permanently neutralized by the overwhelming force of irrefutable truth. I no longer have to look over my shoulder or audit my own accounts for family fraud. The complete eradication of their influence has left my environment pristine, organized, and focused entirely on sustainable growth and genuine community impact. I have taken back the steering wheel of my own destiny. As for my own heart, the healing process has been slow but deeply restorative. For the first time in my adult life, I am not carrying the suffocating burden of another person's manufactured crises. I no longer check my mobile phone anticipating a fabricated financial emergency or a manipulative demand for capital. My mornings are defined by the quiet, comforting routine of a man who has finally reclaimed his own autonomy. I spend my days polishing the chrome bumpers of my classic automobiles and enjoying the simple, profound companionship of Josephine. Our relationship is a beautiful testament to the power of authentic human connection. She does not care about the balance of my corporate trust funds or the vast square footage of my commercial warehouses. She values my integrity, my quiet resilience, and the honest scars on my hands. We share a bond built entirely on mutual respect and shared values, a dynamic that is entirely immune to the corrupting influence of monetary greed. I have learned that the most valuable currency in this world is not liquid cash or commercial real estate. The ultimate wealth is the ability to surround yourself with people who love you for exactly who you are without any hidden motives or financial expectations. I finally have a partner who sits beside me because she wants to, not because she is waiting for an opportunity to inherit the empire I constructed through decades of unrelenting determination. People often ask how a father can find the strength to orchestrate the total financial ruin and federal incarceration of his own flesh and blood. They wonder if the guilt of watching my son stand in a courtroom wearing heavy iron shackles keeps me awake at night. I tell them with absolute, unwavering certainty that my conscience is entirely clear. Allowing Darren to succeed in his monstrous plot would have been the ultimate failure of my parental duty. If I had permitted him to steal my company and lock me away, I would have confirmed his toxic belief that deceit and cruelty are always rewarded. I would have finalized his transformation into a completely irredeemable predator. By stripping away his unearned privilege, forcing him into a concrete cell, and making him face the severe federal consequences of his massive corporate forgery, I delivered the final, most crucial lesson of his life. I taught him that actions carry an undeniable weight. I taught him that genuine character cannot be purchased with a stolen credit card. When I looked at him in the prison visitation room and saw the rough calluses forming on his hands from industrial laundry labor, I did not see a defeated man. I saw a man who was finally painfully learning how to survive on his own merit. I gave him the agonizing gift of reality, knowing it was the only cure for the disease of his unparalleled entitlement. My journey through this dark and treacherous valley of familial betrayal holds a vital lesson for anyone who has ever felt exploited by the people they love. We are often conditioned by society to believe that family ties demand infinite sacrifice and unconditional financial support. We are told that we must endure disrespect, emotional manipulation, and financial abuse simply because the perpetrators share our bloodline. This is a dangerous, soul-crushing lie. You do not owe your life's work to anyone who treats your existence as a disposable commodity. You do not owe your peace of mind to children who view your aging body as an inconvenient obstacle to their unearned inheritance. Kindness without strict boundaries is merely an open invitation for exploitation. Generosity without accountability breeds monstrous entitlement. If you find yourself walking on eggshells in your own home, funding the lavish lifestyles of ungrateful relatives who openly disdain your character, you must find the incredible courage to sever the cord. You must have the bravery to protect your own dignity, even if it requires completely dismantling the artificial family structure you have spent decades trying to hold together. True love requires absolute, unwavering respect. If that respect is entirely absent, you have a fundamental obligation to protect yourself. You must become the architect of your own peace, tearing down the parasitic relationships that threaten your well-being and building a new life upon the solid foundation of absolute self-respect. The sun is currently setting over the distant city skyline, casting long golden shadows across the polished concrete floor of my private garage. I run my hand along the smooth jet-black fender of my restored Mustang, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of a machine I rebuilt piece by piece. My commercial empire is secure. My grandson's future is protected. The parasitic individuals who attempted to consume my legacy have been legally and financially eradicated from my daily existence. I am 69 years old, and I am finally breathing air that is entirely my own. I step into the driver's seat, turn the heavy silver key in the ignition, and listen to the powerful engine roar into life. It is the sound of absolute freedom. I am driving forward into a bright, unburdened future, leaving the toxic wreckage of the past permanently in the rearview mirror. Did you find resonance in my story today? I want to know exactly which city or country you are listening from right now. Please take a moment and let us meet in the comments section below. Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line with entitled family members who severely underestimated your intelligence and your worth? I would love to hear your personal opinions and your own stories of reclaiming your dignity. So please share your thoughts with me in the comments. I am always deeply curious about what you all think regarding these difficult family dynamics. If you liked this story and found value in the lessons shared, you can actively support me by sending a super thanks so I can continue dedicating my time to bringing you more powerful, real-life stories exactly like this one. Thank you so much for your incredibly sweet and ongoing support. I am truly looking forward to reading your comments on the story. On the screen right now, you can clearly see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There is so much more engaging content waiting for you on my channel. Do not forget to hit the like button and actively subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. I will see you in the next life story. I send you all my heartfelt greetings with absolute love and deep respect. Until next time.